Tonight, before we begin, picture a small wooden boat moving very slowly across a great dark harbour, a little more than 2,000 years ago, in the last age of the ancient world. It is night, and the water is black and calm and faintly warm, and the only light comes from the stars, and from one enormous tower of fire standing far out at the mouth of the harbour. A lighthouse so tall that sailors far out at sea can see its flame long before they can see the land. The city behind that flame is the greatest city on earth. It is a city of white marble and long straight streets, of libraries and temples and markets that smell of cedar and salt and spice, and in the middle of it, close to the water, stands a palace the size of a small town. All colonnades and gardens and quiet lamplit rooms. And somewhere in that boat, low down, hidden, wrapped and folded and utterly still, is a young woman not yet 22 years old, being carried toward that palace in secret, because if the wrong men see her face tonight, she will almost certainly be killed before morning. She has come back to her own city like a thief. She has been driven out of it by her own brother, and she has gathered a little army in the desert, and now she has left that army behind and slipped back across the water with a single trusted friend, and she is about to be smuggled past the guards and into the presence of the most powerful man in the world, a Roman general who holds her life and her throne and the whole future of her kingdom in his hands. Everything she has, everything she is, everything her family built over 300 years, all of it now rests on whether one tired, balding, 52-year-old foreigner will look at her and decide that she is worth keeping. That is the gamble she is making tonight, folded up in the dark in the bottom of a boat, and in a little while, when we have settled ourselves properly for sleep, we will find out how it went. But not yet. For now, let the boat drift. Let the great flame burn out at the edge of the water, and let us get comfortable. So settle in now, wherever you are. Let the day you have just had begin to loosen its grip on you, the way a hand slowly unclenches when it no longer needs to hold anything. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been sitting, up near your ears, all day long. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head, because it can, because that is what it is for, and you do not have to hold anything up anymore tonight. There is nothing left for you to do today. Everything that needed doing is either done, or it can wait for the morning, and the morning is a long way off. My only task, from here on, is to talk quietly and steadily, and without hurry, and to tell you the whole long story of a life, from its very beginning to its very end, so that you have something soft and slow to follow down into sleep. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to keep track of the names, or the dates, or who is whose brother, or which war came before which. If you drift off in the first few minutes, that is a success, not a failure. That is exactly what this is for. And if you wake again at some strange hour of the night, you can simply press play once more, and my voice will still be here, still going, still walking gently through the years. If you enjoy these long, quiet histories, and only if you truly do, you might tap the like button or subscribe, so that more sleepless people can find their way to a calm place at the end of the day. And if you feel like it, you could leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the local time is where you are. I love reading them in the quiet hours, and it helps other people lying awake in their own cities feel a little less alone in the dark. But there is no hurry about any of that either. It can wait for the morning too. For now there is only the story, and the sound of my voice, and the slow settling of your own breath. So let us begin, not with the young woman in the boat, but long, long before her, because to understand how she came to be folded up in the dark in the greatest city on earth, we have to go back much further, to a time before her city existed at all, before her family existed, before there was any throne for her to lose. We have to go back nearly 300 years before that night on the water, to a young man on a horse at the edge of the known world. His name was Alexander, and the world would one day call him Alexander the Great, and he was the son of a rough, one-eyed, brilliant king from the wild northern edge of Greece, a place called Macedon. Alexander had inherited his father's army, which was the finest fighting machine anyone had yet built, and he had inherited his father's ambition, which was very nearly bottomless, and with the two of them together he had set out, still a very young man, to conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen, the Empire of Persia, which stretched from the coast of the Mediterranean all the way to the mountains of India. And, astonishingly, he did it. In a series of battles that people would study for the next 2,000 years, he broke the Persian Empire completely, and made himself master of almost everything, from Greece to the edge of the Himalayas, all before he was 30 years old. And on his way through, early in his campaign, Alexander came down into Egypt. Now Egypt, even then, was unimaginably ancient. When Alexander arrived, the pyramids at Giza were already older to him than he is to us. They had been standing in the desert for more than 2,000 years before he was born, weathering slowly, their bright white casing stones gleaming, their purpose already half forgotten. Egypt had been ruled by pharaohs for 3,000 years, one dynasty after another, gods on earth in the eyes of their people, and it had been rich beyond measure the whole time, because of one simple, endlessly repeating miracle. Every single year the great river Nile flooded. Every year, without fail, the river rose and spread across the flat black land on either side of it, and laid down a fresh skin of dark, wet, fertile mud, and then it fell again, and out of that mud grew more grain than the people of Egypt could possibly eat. That grain was the true wealth of Egypt. It was better than gold, because you could not eat gold, and empires in the end run on bread. And Alexander, arriving in this ancient, fertile, fabulously wealthy land, was welcomed almost as a liberator, because the Egyptians had lately been ruled by the Persians, whom they hated, and here was a young conqueror who had just smashed the Persians to pieces. So Egypt opened its gates to him, and Alexander, walking along the flat Mediterranean coast, at a place where a long thin island lay just offshore and made a natural double harbour, stopped and looked, and decided that here, on this exact spot, he would found a new city. He walked out the line of its walls himself, so the story goes, and because he had no chalk to mark the ground, his men marked it out with barley meal from the soldiers' rations, a long pale line curving across the empty coast. And he gave the new city his own name. He called it Alexandria. Then he rode away east, to conquer more of the world, and he never saw his city finished, and in fact, he never saw it again at all, because a few years later, far away in the palace of Babylon, still only 32 years old, at the very peak of his impossible success, Alexander fell suddenly and mysteriously ill, and after a few days of fever, he died. And he left behind no plan, no clear heir, and the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching across 3 continents, with no one obvious to rule it. What he left behind instead was a small group of tough, ambitious, battle-hardened generals, men who had marched and fought beside him for years, men who now looked at that enormous empire, and looked at each other, and each quietly began to wonder how large a piece of it he might be able to grab and keep for himself. One of those generals was a shrewd, careful, unusually clever man named Ptolemy. He was a childhood friend of Alexander's and one of his most trusted officers, and while the other generals fell to squabbling and fighting over the rich central provinces, Ptolemy looked at the map and made a very cold, very sensible calculation. He did not want the whole empire. The whole empire was a trap. Everyone would fight you for it forever. What he wanted was Egypt. Egypt was rich, Egypt fed itself and everyone around it, and best of all, Egypt was defensible, protected by deserts on almost every side and by the sea to the north, so that a careful man might hold it against all comers. So when the empire was carved up among the generals, Ptolemy asked for Egypt, and took it, and settled there, and made the half-built city of Alexandria his capital. And in a move that tells you almost everything about him, one of the first things he did was to steal Alexander's body. The dead conqueror's embalmed corpse was being carried in a magnificent funeral procession back toward Macedon, and Ptolemy intercepted it, took it, and brought it to Egypt, and eventually laid it to rest in a splendid tomb in the heart of Alexandria, because he understood that whoever held the body of Alexander held a kind of magic, a legitimacy, a link to the greatest name in the world. And there, with the founder's bones as his cornerstone, Ptolemy founded a dynasty of his own. He made himself king of Egypt, Ptolemy I, and he passed the throne to his son, who passed it to his son, and so on. And every single one of the kings was named Ptolemy, and a great many of the queens were named Cleopatra, or Arsinoe, or Berenice, over and over down the generations, so that keeping them straight is a genuine challenge even for people who do it for a living. This was the family, this line of Macedonian Greek kings ruling over ancient Egypt, that our young woman in the boat was born into, nearly 300 years after Alexander walked out the walls of her city with a line of barley meal. She was the last of them. She was the final Cleopatra, the seventh queen of that name, and she was, though she could not have known it as a child, the very last pharaoh Egypt would ever have. Before we come to her birth, it is worth sitting for a little while with the strange and glittering family she came from, because it shaped everything about her. The Ptolemies were, to put it gently, a complicated household. They were Greek, not Egyptian, and for most of 300 years they barely bothered to learn the Egyptian language at all. They lived apart, in their marble quarter of Alexandria, spoke Greek, read Greek, worshipped Greek gods alongside the Egyptian ones when it suited them, and ruled the ancient land rather like wealthy foreign landlords who never quite move into the main house. They had also picked up a habit from the old pharaohs that strikes almost everyone as unsettling, which was that they married within the family, brother to sister, again and again, generation after generation. The idea, borrowed from Egyptian royal tradition and from a wish to keep the bloodline and the wealth undivided, was that the royal blood was too precious to mix with anyone outside it. The result, over the centuries, was a family tree that does not so much branch as fold back on itself, and a run of kings and queens who were often each other's siblings and spouses at the same time, which is a habit that tends to age badly, both for a family and for the individuals in it. By the time we reached the last few generations of Ptolemies, the family had also developed a distinct talent for murder. Fathers killed sons, sons killed fathers, brothers killed brothers. Mothers arranged the deaths of their own children, and queens poisoned husbands with a regularity that would be almost comic if it were not so grim. This was the water our young woman would grow up swimming in. From her earliest years she would have understood, without anyone needing to sit her down and explain it, that in her family the people closest to you by blood were also, very often, the people most likely to arrange your death, and that the throne was a thing you held with both hands, every hour of every day, or lost forever. It was not a childhood that encouraged trust. It was a childhood that rewarded watchfulness and cleverness and a very early, very cold understanding of power. And yet, for all that darkness inside the palace, the city outside it was one of the wonders of the world. Alexandria, by the time of her birth, had grown from Alexander's line of barley meal into the largest, richest, most dazzling city in the Mediterranean, home to perhaps 500,000 people, drawn from every corner of the known world, Greeks and Egyptians, Jews and Syrians, sailors and merchants and scholars and priests, all crowded together in a grid of long straight streets that ran down to the double harbour. Out at the harbour mouth, on the little island Alexander had noticed, stood the great lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a tower of pale stone rising higher than almost any building human beings had ever made, with a fire burning at its top all night, and a great polished mirror that threw the light far out to sea. Ships from everywhere came sliding in past it, heavy with wine and timber and silver, and went out again low in the water with Egyptian grain. And in the heart of the city stood the 2 things that made Alexandria not merely rich but immortal, the museum and the library. The museum was not a museum in our sense, a place of glass cases and quiet halls. It was something closer to the world's first great research institute, a place where the Ptolemies paid the finest scholars alive to come and live and eat and argue and think, freed from any need to earn a living, for the single purpose of understanding the world. And beside it stood the library, the most famous library that has ever existed, which set itself the almost mad ambition of collecting every book in the world. The Ptolemies sent agents out across the seas to buy scrolls. They were said to seize the books off every ship that docked in the harbour, copy them, keep the originals, and hand back the copies. They gathered, at the peak, perhaps 500,000 scrolls, the accumulated learning of Greece and Egypt and Babylon and beyond, all under one roof. To grow up in the Palace of Alexandria was to grow up a few minutes' walk from the greatest concentration of knowledge on the planet. And this brings us at last close to her, because her father was a man peculiarly shaped by that glittering, dangerous, declining world. His name was Ptolemy XII, and history has not been kind to him. His own subjects gave him a mocking nickname, Orleats, which means the flute player, or, less politely, the piper, because he liked to play the flute in public religious festivals, which the grand Alexandrians thought was undignified for a king. He was not a strong ruler. By his time, the great days of the Ptolemies were long gone, and the family that had once been the richest and most powerful in the Mediterranean had become weak, quarrelsome, and deeply in debt, and it survived less by its own strength than by the growing tolerance of a new power rising in the west, a power that now loomed over the whole sea, and that would loom over the whole of our story from beginning to end. That power was Rome. In the 300 years since Alexander, while the Ptolemies had been slowly rotting in their marble palace, the Romans had been steadily, relentlessly, unsentimentally conquering everything within reach. One kingdom after another around the Mediterranean had fallen under Roman control, either swallowed outright or reduced to a client. A dependent, a kingdom allowed to keep its crown only so long as it did what Rome wanted and paid what Rome asked. And Egypt, the last great independent kingdom of the eastern Mediterranean, fabulously rich and militarily feeble, was the ripest fruit of all, hanging low, waiting to be picked. Everyone in Alexandria knew it. Everyone in Rome knew it. The only question was when and how and on what terms. Cleopatra's father spent his whole reign trying to answer that question in a way that kept him alive and on his throne, and the way he chose was simple, expensive, and humiliating, he bribed. He borrowed staggering sums of money from Roman financiers, and he used it to buy the friendship of powerful Roman politicians, so that they would formally recognize him as a friend and ally of Rome and protect his crown. It worked, more or less, but it meant that Egypt slid ever deeper into debt to Rome, and that the king of the richest land in the world became, in effect, a man perpetually behind on his payments to loan sharks who happened to command legions. This was the inheritance waiting for the child who was about to be born, a fabulous, ancient, wealthy kingdom, a dazzling city of learning and light, a poisonous, murderous family, a weak and mocked father, a mountain of debt, and standing over all of it, the long, cold shadow of Rome. She was born, as best anyone can tell, in the winter of the year 69 before the Common Era, in the palace at Alexandria. We do not know the exact day. We do not even know for certain who her mother was, though it was very likely the king's sister wife, in the usual Ptolemaic fashion. She was not the eldest child. She had an older sister named Berenice, and another older sister, and she would in time have a younger sister named Arsino, and two much younger brothers, both inevitably named Ptolemy. She was, in the counting of the historians who came later, the seventh Cleopatra, and so we call her Cleopatra the Seventh, though of course to herself she was simply Cleopatra, the name meaning in Greek something like glory of her father or famous in her bloodline, a hopeful name for a child born into a family famous mostly for killing one another. What kind of child she was we can only guess at because no one thought to write it down while it was happening. The records of her childhood are almost entirely blank. But we can say a few things with reasonable confidence, because of what she became. She was, by every later account, extraordinarily intelligent, and she was educated in the Greek manner that the children of the Ptolemies received, which was the finest education available anywhere in the world at that time. She would have been taught by scholars drawn from the museum, the very best minds of the age, and she would have studied rhetoric, the art of speaking and persuading, and philosophy, and mathematics, and astronomy, and literature, and she seems to have soaked all of it up hungrily. She grew up, remember, next door to the greatest library on earth, and there is every sign that she used it. And she did one thing that, as far as we know, none of her ancestors in 300 years had ever bothered to do. She learned the Egyptian language. She learned, in fact, to speak a remarkable number of languages. Later writers claimed she could converse with almost any foreign visitor in his own tongue, Egyptian and Ethiopian and the languages of the desert peoples and of the Hebrews and the Arabs and more, so that she rarely needed an interpreter and could switch from one to another the way another person might change a garment. Whether the full list is exact or a little exaggerated by admiring writers hardly matters. The point is that here was a princess who understood, very young, that words were a kind of power, that to speak to someone in their own language was to reach past their defences and touch something in them directly, and that this was a weapon at least as useful as any army. And she would grow up to be, above all, a survivor, in a family and a world where mere survival was an achievement that most of her brothers and sisters would not manage. But all of that lay ahead. For now she was only a small, watchful, clever girl in a vast marble palace by the sea, learning her letters, listening at doors, and beginning, very slowly, to understand the peculiar and lethal world into which she had been born. When Cleopatra was around 11 years old, the fragile arrangement her father had built with Rome finally cracked, and she was given her first close, unforgettable lesson in how power really worked. Her father's endless borrowing and bribing had made him deeply unpopular in Alexandria, where the people resented the heavy taxes he squeezed out of them to pay his Roman creditors, and resented even more his grovelling before Rome. When Rome, in one of its casual acts of appetite, annexed the neighbouring island of Cyprus, which had been ruled by the king's own brother, and drove that brother to suicide, and the flute player did nothing about it, the people of Alexandria had finally had enough. They rose up and they drove their king out of his own city. And so Cleopatra, still a girl, watched her father flee the palace, a king with no kingdom, and make his way of all places to Rome, to beg the very men who had humiliated him to put him back on his throne. He travelled to the great city on the Tiber, and he lived there as a kind of royal beggar, borrowing still more enormous sums from Roman financiers, promising them repayment out of Egypt's future revenues, and lobbying the powerful men of the Roman Senate to lend him an army. Some historians think the young Cleopatra may have gone with him, and seen Rome herself as a child, and watched, up close, how her father was made to wait and flatter and pay. If so, it was an education no tutor could have given her. Meanwhile, back in Alexandria with the king gone, his eldest daughter, Cleopatra's older sister Berenice, did the entirely Ptolemaic thing, and simply took the throne for herself, and began to rule as queen in her father's place. For a few years then, the sisters were on opposite sides of a family split that could only end one way, and it ended when the flute player finally succeeded in buying his army. A Roman governor in the east, named Gabinius, was persuaded, with the promise of an almost unimaginable bribe, 10,000 talents, a sum so vast it is hard to translate, to march a Roman army into Egypt and put the piper back on his throne by force. And here, in the ranks of that Roman army, we meet, for a brief moment, a young cavalry commander, a big, handsome, athletic, cheerful young Roman officer, brave and popular with his men, who led the charge that opened the road into Egypt. His name was Marcus Antonius, and history remembers him as Mark Antony. He was at this point a young man in his mid-20s with a growing reputation and a great appetite for life, and he rode into Alexandria as a conqueror's officer, and then, having done his job, he rode away again, back to his career in the Roman wars. He and the 14-year-old princess in the palace may have glimpsed each other, or may not have. The sources hint at it and cannot prove it. But the seed of everything that would come 20 years later was planted in that moment, when the soldier who would one day give up the world for her first set foot in her city. The restoration itself was brutal. The flute player, back on his throne with Roman swords at his back, promptly had his own daughter Berenice executed, put to death for the crime of having ruled in his absence. Cleopatra, now a teenager, watched her father kill her older sister. It is impossible to know what she felt. But it is not hard to guess what she learned, which was that in this family the throne was worth more than a daughter's life, that mercy toward a rival was simply another word for suicide, and that Roman soldiers, brought at the right price, could put a Ptolemy on the throne or take one off it as easily as moving a piece across a board. She would remember all 3 lessons for the rest of her life, and act on all 3. Her father did not have many years left. He had spent everything, borrowed everything, bribed everyone, and he had bought himself only a short and shaky final reign. When Cleopatra was about 18 years old, in the year 51 before the Common Era, the flute player died, worn out, still deep in debt, leaving behind a will that tried, hopefully and hopelessly, to hold his poisonous family together. In that will, he left the throne of Egypt jointly to 2 of his children, to Cleopatra, his clever, capable 18-year-old daughter, and to her little brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was at that moment about 10 years old. And, in keeping with the family custom, the 2 of them, the grown young woman and the little boy, were to be considered husband and wife as well as co-rulers, sister and brother married on the throne. It was a formula for disaster, and everyone involved surely knew it. An 18-year-old queen of unusual intelligence and iron was never going to share power comfortably with a 10-year-old boy, and, more to the point, she was never going to share it with the ambitious, grasping men who surrounded that boy and ruled in his name. For a young king of 10 is not really a king at all. He is a puppet, and the hands inside the puppet were 3 in particular: a scheming eunuch named Pothinus, who controlled the treasury and the boy's household, and through him, much of the government, a general named Achillas, who commanded the army, and a Greek tutor named Theodotus, a smooth and clever man who had the boy's ear. These 3 men looked at the 18-year-old queen and saw a threat to everything they wanted, which was to rule Egypt themselves through her malleable little brother. And Cleopatra looked at these 3 men and saw exactly what they were. So the reign began, from its very first day, as a silent, deadly struggle for control between the young queen on one side and her brother's handlers on the other, a struggle carried on in the corridors and council chambers of the palace, in the wording of official decrees, in the loyalties of officials and priests and soldiers, each side manoeuvring for advantage, waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. For a while, Cleopatra had the upper hand. She was older, cleverer, more forceful, and she moved quickly to establish herself as the dominant partner. On the official documents and coins of the early reign, it is her name that comes first, and her brother's second, which in the careful language of Ptolemaic power was a loud statement that she, and not the boy, was in charge. She did something else too, something none of her recent ancestors had done, something that showed a political imagination well beyond her years. She reached past the narrow Greek world of the Alexandrian court, and she reached out to the ancient Egyptian people and their priests, the vast native population that the Ptolemies had ruled for 3 centuries while barely acknowledging them. Early in her reign she travelled south up the Nile to the sacred sites of Old Egypt, and she took part in the most solemn religious ceremonies of the Egyptian faith, presenting herself not merely as a Greek queen in a marble palace, but as a true pharaoh, a living link to the gods in the eyes of the Egyptian people. She learned to present herself as the goddess Isis, the great mother goddess of Egypt, whose worship was beloved across the whole Eastern world. This was not simple vanity. It was a shrewd, deliberate broadening of her base of support, a bid to root herself in the deep ancient loyalty of the Egyptian people beneath and beyond the treacherous shallows of the court. She understood, as her brother's handlers perhaps did not, that a throne rests on more than the men in the room. It rests on how millions of ordinary people, out in the fields and villages and temples, imagine the person who wears the crown. But intelligence and vision were not, by themselves, enough to save her. Because she was young, and she was, for all her cleverness, still learning, and the men around her brother were patient and ruthless, and many. And Egypt itself in these years was suffering. There were bad harvests, the Nile flood, that annual miracle on which everything depended, came in low for 2 years running, and low water meant thin crops, and thin crops meant hunger and rising prices and grumbling in the streets of Alexandria, the most dangerous sound a Ptolemy could hear. Hungry cities look for someone to blame, and a young queen at the top is always an easy target. Slowly, cleverly, her brother's handlers turned the situation to their advantage. They spread the blame for the hard times onto her. They worked on the boy king, and on the officials, and on the mob. And at last, when Cleopatra was about 20 years old, roughly 2 years into her reign, they made their move, and it succeeded. The eunuch and the general and the tutor, in the name of the boy king, drove Cleopatra from power. She lost the court, lost the capital, lost the treasury, lost the loyal officials, and had to flee Alexandria altogether to save her life, exactly as her father had fled a decade before. She had gone in 2 short years from queen of the richest land in the world to a fugitive, hunted and very nearly finished. Now a lesser person in that position might have given up or gone into quiet hiding or made for some distant safe corner of the world to live out her days. Cleopatra did none of those things. Driven out of Egypt, she went east into the lands of Syria and the desert borders, and she did the boldest thing available to her. She began from nothing to raise an army of her own. She gathered mercenaries and desert fighters and whatever loyal men she could find, spending promises and charm and whatever wealth she had managed to carry out with her. And she brought that army back to the eastern edge of Egypt, and there she sat, on the frontier, facing her brother's forces across the sand, the 2 Ptolemies and their armies glaring at each other on the border of their own kingdom, each waiting for a chance to destroy the other. It was, for the moment, a stalemate, and here the story of one Egyptian family's quarrel suddenly collides with the largest event in the world, because at exactly this time the whole Roman world was tearing itself apart in a gigantic civil war, and that war was about to come crashing down onto the sands of Egypt and change Cleopatra's life forever. To understand it, we have to step back, for a moment, from the palace by the Nile and look at Rome. For centuries Rome had been a republic, governed not by a king, which the Romans hated and feared above all things, but by its senate and its elected officials, its power carefully divided so that no one man could ever seize the whole of it. But by Cleopatra's time that old republic was breaking down under the weight of its own conquests, and the real power had come to rest with a handful of enormously wealthy generals who commanded armies personally loyal to themselves. 2 of these men had risen far above the rest. One was Pompey, called Pompey the Great, a brilliant and famous general, older now, grand and a little vain, who had conquered much of the East and been for years the first man in Rome. The other was younger, leaner, and even more dangerous, Gaius Julius Caesar, a nobleman of ancient family but modest fortune, a spellbinding speaker, a writer of clean-cold prose, a politician of genius, and, as he had lately proved by conquering the whole of Gaul in a savage 8-year war, one of the greatest generals who ever lived. For a time these 2 had been allies, and Pompey had even married Caesar's daughter. But alliances of that kind between men who each want to be first never last, and when Caesar's daughter died the last bond between them snapped. The Senate, fearing Caesar's growing power, sided with Pompey and ordered Caesar to give up his army and come home as a private citizen, which everyone understood would mean his ruin or his death. And Caesar, standing at the northern border of Italy at a small river called the Rubicon, made the decision that would echo for 2,000 years. He refused to disband his army. Instead, he led it across the river into Italy against his own government and plunged the Roman world into civil war. Caesar and Pompey, the two greatest men in Rome, now fought for the mastery of the entire Mediterranean, and their armies chased each other across Italy and Spain and Greece until at last, on a plain in northern Greece called Pharsalus, they met in a great battle, and Caesar, though heavily outnumbered, won a crushing and total victory. Pompey the Great, the conqueror of the East, the first man of Rome, fled the field a beaten fugitive, with only a few companions running for his life across the sea. And where did Pompey run? He ran to Egypt. He had old ties to the Ptolemies. He had helped Cleopatra's father in the past. Egypt was rich and far from Caesar, and he imagined he could find shelter there, regroup, and perhaps raise a new army out of Egypt's wealth. So Pompey's ship came sailing toward the Egyptian coast, toward the very place where the boy King Ptolemy and his handlers were encamped with their army, glaring across the sand at Cleopatra. And now the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles and the tutor Theodotus had a terrible decision to make, and the way they made it tells you everything about the world Cleopatra lived in. They knew that Pompey had just lost, and that Caesar was coming after him, and that Caesar was now, plainly, going to be the master of the world. To shelter Pompey would be to make an enemy of Caesar. To turn him away would earn Caesar's gratitude, but perhaps not much else. But to kill him, they reasoned, coldly, would put the winner forever in their debt, and remove a dangerous guest, and settle the matter cleanly. So as Pompey the Great, once the first man in Rome, was rowed toward the Egyptian shore in a small boat, trusting in the hospitality of a kingdom his family had befriended, the boy king's men waited for him on the beach, and as he stepped toward the sand, they stabbed him to death in front of his wife and son, who were watching from the ship offshore, helpless, too far away to do anything but scream. They cut off his head, to keep as a gift, and they left his body naked on the beach. It was one of the most infamous murders of the ancient world, and it was meant, by the men who ordered it, as a favour to Caesar. When Caesar himself arrived at Alexandria a few days later, in pursuit of his rival, and the boy king's men proudly brought out the severed head and the signet ring of Pompey to present to him, expecting thanks, Caesar, by every account, turned away and wept. Whatever Pompey had become, he had been a great Roman, and Caesar's son-in-law, and a worthy enemy, and to see him murdered and mutilated by a pack of scheming palace courtiers, foreigners, disgusted the Roman to his core. It was, for Cleopatra's brother and his handlers, a catastrophic misreading of the man they were trying to please, and it set the stage for everything that followed, because Caesar did not simply take Pompey's head and sail away. Caesar came ashore into Alexandria with a relatively small force of Roman soldiers, and he installed himself in the royal palace, the very palace of the Ptolemies, and he announced that he intended to settle the dispute over the Egyptian throne. He had, he pointed out, a certain right to do so. The old flute player had named Rome as the guardian of his children's inheritance, and Caesar now was Rome. And besides, Egypt owed Rome a colossal amount of money, the debts the flute player had run up all those years ago, and Caesar, whose war had left him desperately short of cash, meant to collect. So the Roman marched into the palace and made himself at home and summoned the feuding royal children to submit their quarrel to his judgment. This was, for Cleopatra, out on the frontier with her little army, both a mortal danger and the chance of a lifetime. The most powerful man in the world was sitting in her palace, holding the fate of her throne in his hands, and he was minded to decide between her and her brother. Whoever reached him first and won him over would win everything. But there was a terrible difficulty. Her brother held Alexandria, and her brother's army held the roads and the harbour, and they were watching for her, and they would kill her the instant she showed her face. She could not simply walk into the city and request an audience. She would be dead before she reached the palace gates. She had to get to Caesar, past her brother's soldiers, unseen, and she had to do it herself, because this was not a thing she could send a messenger to do. Whatever spell she was going to cast on the Roman, she would have to cast it in person, with her own voice and her own presence, and she would have to survive long enough to begin. And this is the moment, and this is the boat, and this is the young woman folded up in the dark that we began with tonight, at the very beginning, before you closed your eyes. Now, at last, we can see how she got there, and we can see what she did. She had with her one loyal and resourceful friend, a Sicilian Greek named Apollodorus, and between them they worked out a plan that was so daring and so theatrical that it has never been forgotten. Under cover of darkness they crossed the harbour in a small boat, and when they reached the palace shore, Apollodorus took a large sack of the kind used to carry bedding, or perhaps a rolled-up carpet, the sources differ, and inside it he placed the Queen of Egypt, curled up small and still, and he tied it closed, and he hoisted the whole bundle over his shoulder, and he simply walked up to the palace, a servant carrying a bundle of linens to the great Roman guest, and the guards, seeing nothing but a rug on a servant's back, let him pass. He carried her through the gates, through the corridors, into the private quarters where Caesar was lodged, and there, in front of the astonished Roman, he set the bundle down and untied it, and out of it, uncurling, rising to her feet, dishevelled and travel-stained, and utterly composed, came the Queen of Egypt. It is one of the great entrances in all of history, and it worked exactly as she must have hoped. Consider it from Caesar's side. He was 52 years old, a man who had seen everything the world had to offer, conquered nations, been worshipped and feared, grown a little weary and a little cynical, and he was sitting in a foreign palace in the middle of a dangerous city, dealing with a squalid family murder and a pile of debts. And then, out of a rolled carpet, steps a young woman of 21, clever and quick and unafraid, who has just had herself smuggled through her enemy's lines at the risk of her life for the single purpose of speaking to him. Whatever else it was magnificent, and Caesar, who admired boldness above almost every other quality, and who had a lifelong weakness for spirited and intelligent women, was captivated. Here it is worth pausing to say something about her famous beauty, because it is one of the most misunderstood things about her. For 2,000 years the world has imagined Cleopatra as a woman of overwhelming physical beauty, the most beautiful woman who ever lived, a face to launch fleets. But the people who actually met her, or who wrote closest to her time, tell a subtler and far more interesting story. Her beauty, one ancient writer says carefully, was not in itself incomparable, not the kind that struck people dumb at first sight. What was incomparable was the whole of her, the charm of her presence, the sweetness and persuasion of her voice, which people compared to a many-stringed instrument that she could tune to any mood, the quickness of her wit, the way she made whoever she was speaking with feel that he was the most interesting person in the world. It was not a face, it was a force. It was intelligence and charm and will and voice and presence, all bound together and pointed, with total concentration, at the person in front of her. That is a far rarer and far more dangerous gift than mere beauty. And it is the gift she now turned, at full strength, on the tired master of the world. By the time the sun rose over Alexandria, whatever had passed between them in the night, the essential thing was done. Caesar had decided that Cleopatra, and not her brother, was the ruler of Egypt he wished to back, and, before very long, she was not only his ally but his lover, and Egypt's fate and Rome's and hers were bound together in a single knot. When the boy King Ptolemy discovered, the next morning, that his sister was inside the palace and had spent the night with Caesar, he flew into a childish rage, ran out into the streets of Alexandria, tore the crown from his own head and flung it down, and screamed to the crowds that he had been betrayed, trying to raise the city against the Romans. It very nearly worked. The people of Alexandria were proud and volatile and had no love for Romans camped in their palace, and the boy king's general Achillas had a large army, far larger than the small force Caesar had brought with him. The city rose, the army closed in, and Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, found himself and his handful of soldiers, and Cleopatra, trapped in the palace quarter of Alexandria, besieged, cut off, badly outnumbered, fighting for their lives. This was the war that history calls the Alexandrian War, and it was a grim, close, desperate affair, fought street by street and wall by wall in the greatest city in the world. Caesar's men held the palace and part of the harbour and fought off assault after assault. At one point, to keep the enemy fleet from overwhelming him, Caesar ordered ships in the harbour set on fire, and the fire spread ashore, and it was in this blaze, according to the most famous and most mournful tradition, that a portion of the great library of Alexandria, or its stored scrolls near the docks, was destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of irreplaceable books turned to ash and drifting smoke over the water. One of the saddest accidental losses in the history of human learning. Though scholars still argue bitterly about how much was truly lost that day and how much survived, the fighting swayed back and forth for months. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, seeing a chance, slipped out of the palace, joined the Egyptian army, and had herself proclaimed queen, so that now there were in effect 3 or 4 Ptolemies all claiming the throne at once, which was very much the family style. Caesar, hemmed in and hard-pressed, sent out desperate calls for reinforcements to Rome's allies in the east. And at last, in the nick of time, as such things go in the best stories and occasionally in real life, a relieving army marched overland to his rescue, and Caesar broke out of the city and met the Egyptian army in open battle beyond the walls and destroyed it. In the rout that followed, the boy king Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's brother and husband and enemy, tried to flee across the Nile by boat, and the boat, overloaded with panicking men, capsized, and the boy king, weighed down by his golden armour, sank beneath the muddy water of the river his family had ruled for 300 years, and drowned, and his body was later dragged from the mud, still in its gilded harness, so that no one could ever claim he had survived. The eunuch Pothinus, the great schemer, Caesar had already put to death. The scheming tutor fled. The rebel sister Arsinoe was captured and would later be paraded through Rome in chains. And when the smoke cleared over the battered city, Cleopatra, who a year before had been a hunted fugitive with a borrowed army, was Queen of Egypt, secure, restored, and standing beside the most powerful man in the world, who was also now the father of the child she was carrying. She was 21 years old, and she had gambled everything, folded up in the dark in the bottom of a boat, and she had won. With the war won and the city quiet, there came, for a little while, something that had been almost entirely absent from Cleopatra's life so far, and would be almost entirely absent from it again, a season of peace, and even of pleasure. Caesar, the busiest and most driven man in the world, a man with a whole empire waiting for him, and enemies still to crush, did a very surprising thing in the spring after the Alexandrian War ended. He stayed. He lingered in Egypt with Cleopatra for weeks, and the two of them made a leisurely journey together up the Nile into the heart of ancient Egypt on a great royal barge, a floating palace, with a long train of ships behind them. It was, on one level, a piece of theatre, a way of showing the Egyptian people their restored queen sailing among them under the protection of Rome, and of showing Caesar the almost unimaginable antiquity and wealth of the land he had just secured. But it reads across the centuries as something more than statecraft. It reads as a kind of honeymoon, two extraordinary people, the cleverest man and the cleverest woman of their age, drifting slowly up the greatest river in the world, past temples older than memory, past the vast stone faces of dead kings, talking, one imagines, endlessly about everything. For Caesar was a man of restless mind, and Cleopatra a woman of deep learning. And they must have found in each other a rare match. Whatever it was, it could not last, and Caesar knew it better than anyone. The world was on fire and would not wait. There were still armies loyal to the memory of Pompey fighting against him in Africa and in Spain, and Rome itself needed its master. And so, that summer, Caesar tore himself away and left Egypt and plunged back into the endless business of conquering and governing the world. He left behind him a few Roman legions to keep the peace, and, not incidentally, to remind Cleopatra whose friendship kept her on her throne, and he left behind him something else. For not long after he sailed away, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, and she named him Ptolemy Caesar, and the people of Alexandria, with their gift for a sharp nickname, called the boy Caesarion, Little Caesar. She proclaimed to the world that this child was the son of Julius Caesar himself. And, given the timing and the circumstances, there is no strong reason to doubt it, though Caesar, for reasons of Roman politics, would never quite openly acknowledge the boy as his heir. For Cleopatra, this son was the most valuable thing she possessed. He was a living bridge between the two greatest powers on earth, a child in whose veins ran the blood of the Ptolemies and the blood of Caesar, the heir of Alexander's Egypt, and potentially the heir of Rome itself. Around this small boy she would build the great dream of the rest of her life. The dream of a dynasty that would join Egypt and Rome, east and west, into a single royal house, with her children on the thrones of the world. Meanwhile, on the surface, everything remained proper and traditional. Cleopatra, having lost one brother husband to the mud of the Nile, was promptly married, in the endless Ptolemaic fashion, to her remaining younger brother, a boy of about 11 named Ptolemy XIV. And the two of them reigned, on paper, as joint monarchs, sister and brother, queen and king. But no one was fooled, least of all the boy. Cleopatra ruled Egypt, alone and completely. The child husband was a formality, a piece of constitutional decoration required by custom, with no more real power than a statue. She was, at last, exactly what she had been born and raised, and had fought and gambled to become, the sole and unquestioned ruler of the richest kingdom in the world, secure on her throne, backed by the master of Rome and mother of his son. She was not yet 23 years old. For the next couple of years, Cleopatra devoted herself to ruling Egypt, and by every measure she ruled it well. She was, it turns out, not merely a schemer and a charmer, but a serious and capable head of state, attentive to the business of government in a way many of her ancestors had not been. She managed the grain supply and the flooding of the Nile, on which the wealth and the peace of the whole country depended. She kept a close eye on the coinage and the treasury. She worked to keep Egypt prosperous and its cities fed and its temples honoured, cultivating both the Greek elite of Alexandria and the Egyptian priesthood and people of the countryside, wearing as it were two crowns at once, the Greek and the Egyptian, and wearing both convincingly. She was, in the ordinary daily grind of administration, a competent and even a rather good monarch, and it is worth remembering that, underneath the legend of the seductress, because it is the part of her the legend tends to forget. But her fate was never going to be decided by the good management of grain. Her fate was tied, now and forever, to Rome, and to the towering, dangerous figure of the man in Rome who had made her queen. And so, when Caesar, having at last crushed the final armies of his enemies and made himself the undisputed master of the entire Roman world, summoned her, she went. Around the year 46 before the Common Era, Cleopatra travelled to Rome itself, with her little son and her official brother husband and a great royal retinue. And Caesar installed her in one of his own villas across the river Tiber, in his gardens on the very edge of the city, and there she lived, a foreign queen, an Eastern monarch, the mother of the dictator's child, in the heart of the Roman Republic. It was, for the Romans, a scandal and a wonder and a deep offence all at once. Rome, remember, prided itself above all on being a republic, on having no king, on having thrown out its last king centuries before, and sworn a great and sacred oath never to endure another. Kings, to a proper Roman of the old school, were the ultimate horror, the thing the whole state existed to prevent. And now here was the most powerful Roman alive, Caesar, whose own power was already looking uncomfortably king-like, openly keeping an actual foreign queen in a villa across the river, a queen who called herself a living goddess, and who had borne him a son. Conservative Romans watched, and muttered, and hated it, and hated her. And Caesar, either not noticing or not caring, poured fuel on the fire. He had a statue of Cleopatra made, a golden statue, and he placed it in the temple of Venus, the goddess from whom his own family claimed descent, so that the Queen of Egypt stood, in gold, in one of the holiest shrines of Rome, next to the goddess herself. To Cleopatra, this was a supreme honour and a public declaration of her importance. To many Romans, it was an outrage almost beyond words. A foreign woman set up as a goddess in the city of the free, and it fed a growing, dangerous resentment, not only against her, but against Caesar himself, and the direction in which he seemed to be taking the Roman world. While Cleopatra lived in her villa across the Tiber, Caesar reached the summit of his power, and it was a lonely and precarious summit. He had himself made dictator, first for 10 years and then for life, a position that gave him in practice the powers of a king in everything but name, and it was the name precisely that Rome could not stomach. He reformed and reordered the state with tremendous energy. He settled his veteran soldiers on land. He relieved debts. He reorganized the government of the provinces. He planned great public works and new colonies. He pardoned many of his old enemies with a famous and, as it turned out, fatal generosity. And in one reform, he left a mark on the daily life of the entire world that endures to this very day, in the calendar you glance at without thinking. For the old Roman calendar had drifted badly out of step with the seasons, a tangle of miscounted days that the priests fudged and manipulated for political advantage, until the months no longer matched the sun. Caesar, wanting order, turned to the astronomers of the most learned city in the world, and it was Egyptian and Alexandrian science, the accumulated star-watching of Cleopatra's own capital, that gave him the answer, a solar calendar of 365 days, with an extra day added every 4th year to keep it true. This is the calendar, refined only slightly since, that the world still uses, and it is a quiet, permanent thread connecting Cleopatra's Alexandria to the date at the top of your own screen tonight. But calendars do not get a man killed. What was getting Caesar killed, day by day, was the growing suspicion among the proud men of the Senate that he meant to make himself king in name as well as in fact, and to turn the Roman Republic, that ancient thing they loved and served and defined themselves by, into a monarchy, with himself as monarch and, perhaps, with that half-Egyptian boy across the river as his heir. There was an ugly, telling little incident at a public festival, when a fellow Roman offered Caesar a royal crown before the crowd, and Caesar, reading the mood, pushed it away, twice, and the crowd cheered his refusal, and everyone saw in that awkward pantomime both that some men around him wanted him crowned, and that the people were not ready for it. It was theatre, and it was a warning, and Caesar did not heed it enough. He dismissed his bodyguard, he walked among the senators as one of them, he trusted in his own indispensability and in the loyalty of the men he had pardoned. And a group of those men, some 60 senators, including old enemies he had spared, and even some he had counted as friends, led by a hard, principled republican named Cassius, and by a famous idealist named Brutus, whom Caesar had loved and treated almost as a son, resolved that the only way to save the republic from becoming a monarchy was to kill the man who was becoming a monarch. They chose their day, a meeting of the Senate in the middle of March, a date the Romans called the Ides of March, in the year 44 before the Common Era. And on that morning, in the hall where the Senate met, they crowded around Caesar as if to present a petition, and then they drew the daggers they had hidden in their togas, and they stabbed him, again and again, more than 20 wounds, the great dictator falling at last at the foot of a statue, wrapping his head in his robe so as not to be seen to die, murdered by the very men he had spared in the heart of the city he had mastered. The most powerful man in the world, Cleopatra's protector, her lover, the father of her son, the foundation on which she had built her whole safety and her whole dream, was dead on the floor of the Senate, and the world he had held together in his single hands cracked apart in an instant. For Cleopatra, still living in the villa across the river, the news must have landed like the end of everything. In a single stroke she had lost her protector and her place. She was a foreign queen, deeply resented, sitting in a hostile city that had just murdered the one man who guaranteed her welcome. and she was more exposed now than she had been since the night in the boat. Worse, the assassins, in killing Caesar, had plunged Rome instantly back into chaos, and within months into a new and even more terrible civil war, and no one could yet say who would come out on top, and until that was settled, no one's throne anywhere was safe. And there was a bitter personal disappointment folded inside the political catastrophe. When Caesar's will was read, it turned out that he had not, after all, named her son Caesarion as his heir. He could not have. A half-Egyptian boy, son of a foreign queen, could never have been accepted by Rome. Instead, Caesar had adopted, as his son and principal heir, a great nephew of his, a cool, sickly, unremarkable-seeming 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius, a young man almost no one had heard of, who now suddenly inherited Caesar's name, Caesar's fortune, and, most dangerously of all, the fierce loyalty of Caesar's veteran soldiers. We will call him, as history soon would, Octavian, and you should fix him in your mind, quietly, as the third of the great Roman men whose lives cross Cleopatra's, because he is the one who will destroy her. But that lay years in the future. For now, Cleopatra did the only sensible thing. She gathered her son and her retinue, and she got out of Rome, quickly and quietly, before the chaos could swallow her, and she sailed back home to Egypt, back to Alexandria, back to the one place in the world that was truly hers, to wait and to watch, and to see which way the world would break. And on her way home, or soon after her arrival, her second brother-husband, the boy Ptolemy XIV, now about 15 years old, and beginning to be old enough to be a rival rather than a decoration, conveniently died. The ancient writers state plainly what everyone assumed, that Cleopatra had him poisoned, quietly removing the last person with a legitimate claim to share her throne. Whether she truly did the deed we cannot prove, but it is entirely in keeping with everything her family had ever done, and with the cold logic of her situation, and few historians doubt it. With the boy gone, Cleopatra raised her own small son Caesarion, then about 3 years old, to be her co-ruler and official partner on the throne, so that now the two names on the coins and the decrees of Egypt were hers and her son's, mother and child, the last of the Ptolemies and the son of Caesar, reigning together over the Nile. Now the story leaves Egypt for a while and follows the storm gathering in the west, because until that storm settled, Cleopatra could do nothing but wait and try to guess which way to lean. Caesar's murder had not saved the Republic, it had killed it. Into the vacuum left by his death stepped, first, the man we already met long ago as a young cavalry officer riding into Egypt, and who had since become Caesar's right hand and second in command, Mark Antony. Antony was, at this point in his prime, a big, powerful, genial, hard-drinking, warm-hearted, reckless man, beloved by his soldiers, who saw in him one of their own, a general who ate their food and shared their hardships and their jokes. He was brave to the point of foolishness, generous to the point of ruin, loyal, sentimental, easily led by his appetites and his affections, a magnificent soldier and a poor judge of the long game. He was, in almost every way, the opposite of the cold, patient, calculating 18-year-old Octavian, who now arrived in Rome to claim Caesar's name and Caesar's fortune. At first Antony and Octavian were bitter rivals, each wanting to be Caesar's true successor, and they nearly went to war with each other. But they shared a common enemy, the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had fled east and were raising huge armies in Greece and the eastern provinces, and common enemies make quick friends. So Antony and Octavian, together with a third lesser man named Lepidus, patched up their quarrel and joined forces, and had themselves granted, by a cowed and frightened Rome, an official, legal, almost unlimited power to set the state in order. This alliance of 3 men is called the Second Triumvirate, and it began its work with an act of cold, systematic terror. To raise money for their armies and to destroy their enemies at home, the 3 of them drew up lists, proscription lists, the names of hundreds of wealthy and prominent Romans who were simply declared outlaws, to be hunted down and killed, their property seized to fill the war chest. Old scores were settled, each of the three traded away friends and relatives to the other's vengeance. The most famous victim was the great orator Cicero, the voice of the old republic, who had made an enemy of Antony with his savage speeches, and who was hunted down and killed, his head and hands cut off and nailed up in the Roman Forum as a warning, the tongue and the writing hand of the Republic's greatest defender put on grisly display. It was a season of blood, and it announced, unmistakably, the kind of men who would now decide the fate of the world, and the fate of the Queen watching from Alexandria. Then the triumvirs turned east to face the assassins. Antony and Octavian led their combined armies across to Greece, and there, near a city called Philippi, in the year 42 before the Common Era, they met the great army of Brutus and Cassius in two enormous battles. Octavian, sickly and no soldier, was almost useless and hid. By one account, in the marshes it was Antony's generalship and Antony's fighting spirit that carried the day. The armies of the assassins were broken, and first Cassius and then Brutus, seeing all was lost, took their own lives, falling on their swords rather than be captured, and with them died the last real hope of the old Roman Republic. The world would now be ruled by one man. The only question left was which one. After Philippi, the victors divided the Roman world between them, like men splitting an inheritance. Lepidus, the junior partner, was gradually squeezed out. The young Octavian took the west, Italy and Rome itself, the heart of things, but also its troubles, the endless task of finding land for tens of thousands of demanding veteran soldiers. And Antony, the great victor of Philippi, the senior partner, the famous general at the height of his glory, took the East, Greece and Asia and Syria and the rich, ancient, storied kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean, and hanging like a golden fruit at the far end of his new domain, Egypt. It was at the time thought to be by far the better half of the bargain, for the East was where the wealth was, the old money, the treasure of kingdoms. And it meant that Mark Antony was now, in effect, the lord of the entire Eastern world, and that the Queen of Egypt, whether she liked it or not, had a new Roman master, and a new Roman to win over or to fear. Antony's first great task in the East was to raise money, mountains of it, to pay for the coming reckoning with Octavian that every clever person could already see approaching, and to fund a grand project of his own, the conquest of Parthia, the great empire to the east, beyond the Euphrates, the one power that had ever truly humbled Rome, the unfinished business Caesar himself had been planning to settle when he was murdered. Antony dreamed of doing what Caesar had not lived to do, of marching east like a new Alexander and adding the Parthian Empire to Rome's, and covering himself in a glory that would make him, beyond all argument, the first man in the world. And for that he needed money, and men, and grain, and ships, and there was one place in his new domain that had more of all those things than anywhere else, one fabulously rich kingdom, whose queen had, awkwardly, given aid of an uncertain and suspicious kind during the recent wars, and whose loyalty and whose treasure Antony now meant to secure. So Mark Antony sent a summons to Cleopatra, ordering the Queen of Egypt to come to him, to present herself before him in the city of Tarsus, in the south of what is now Turkey, and to explain herself, and, it was understood, to open her treasury to his cause. It was framed as a command from a master to a subject ruler, and a lesser monarch would have hurried to obey in fear. Cleopatra was not a lesser monarch, and she had taken the measure of Mark Antony long ago. She knew a great deal about him. She knew he was brave and vain and sentimental and pleasure-loving, that he loved a spectacle and a feast and a grand gesture, that he wanted more than almost anything to be admired, to be treated as a great man, a new Hercules, a new Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry with whom he liked to compare himself. She knew, in other words, exactly which strings to pull, and so she did not come to Tarsus as a nervous subject summoned to account for herself. She took her time, she let him wait, and then she came, when she was good and ready, in a way calculated to strike Antony straight through his every weakness at once, and to turn a summons meant to humble her into the most famous seduction in the history of the world. She sailed up the river to Tarsus in a barge that people would still be describing and painters would still be painting 2,000 years later. Its stern was covered in gold. Its sails were purple, the rarest and most costly colour in the ancient world, dyed from the crushed shells of countless sea creatures, a colour that by itself announced almost limitless wealth. Its oars were silver, and they rose and fell in time to the music of flutes and pipes and harps that floated across the water. Perfumed smoke drifted from the ship so that the very air of the riverbanks grew sweet, and crowds gathered along the shore to watch it pass. And Cleopatra herself lay beneath a canopy embroidered with gold, dressed as the goddess of love, while beautiful boys dressed as little cupids fanned her, and lovely young women dressed as sea nymphs and graces handled the ropes and the rudder. It was a floating vision, a piece of pure theatre, an entire mythology sailing up the river toward the waiting Roman. And the effect was exactly as she intended. Word ran through the city that the goddess of love had come to feast with the god of wine. For the good of Asia, the crowds abandoned the marketplace, where Antony sat in state to conduct his official business, and drifted away to the riverbank to see the wonder, until Antony found himself sitting alone on his platform, with no audience left at all, which is a fine way for a summoner to discover who is really in charge. When he sent word inviting the queen to dine with him, she gently turned it around, and invited him instead to come to her, aboard her ship, and he came, and she received him with a banquet of such staggering, careless extravagance, the hall blazing with lights hung in intricate patterns, the tables loaded with gold and jewels, that the plain, soldierly Roman was left almost speechless. And when he stammered something about the astonishing display, she waved it all away as a trifle, and made him a present of the whole glittering setting, the plates, the couches, the cups, everything. Night after night she outdid herself, each feast grander than the last, until Antony, who fancied himself a great and generous host and a connoisseur of pleasure, understood that he was hopelessly outmatched, that he was a rough soldier in the presence of a genius of luxury and charm, and, being the man he was, warm and open and unable to guard himself, he did not resent it. He fell in love with her, completely, and the summons that was meant to make her his subject ended with him hers. There is an old story from these days that captures the game the two of them played, whether or not it is literally true. Antony, it is said, boasted of the splendour of his own banquets, and Cleopatra wagered that she could spend, on a single meal, a sum so enormous it beggared belief. When the day came, the feast set before Antony was fine, but not obviously worth the impossible sum, and he began to smile, thinking he had won the bet. Then the queen called for the second course, which was nothing but a single cup of strong vinegar. She was wearing in her ears two of the largest and most perfect pearls in the world, an inheritance of kings. She took one of them off, dropped it into the cup, let the vinegar dissolve it, and drank it down, swallowing, at a gulp. A fortune that could have fed a city, and she reached for the second pearl to do the same before the judge of the wager stopped her and declared, laughing, that she had plainly won. Whether it happened or not, it is a perfect little parable of who she was to Antony, and of the world she opened to him, a world of boundless wealth and boundless daring, where a queen might drink a kingdom for a joke, and where the plodding accounts of Roman ambition dissolved, like the pearl, in the strong sweet vinegar of the East. Antony did not go on to Parthia that year. He did not go anywhere. When the season of feasting at Tarsus ended, he did the thing that would define the rest of his life and give Octavian, in the end, the weapon to destroy him. He followed Cleopatra home. He went with her to Alexandria, and he settled there, in her palace as her guest and her lover, and he spent the whole of that winter in the greatest city in the world, doing, as far as anyone could tell, almost nothing at all except enjoy himself. The great Roman general, the victor of Philippi, the lord of the East, the man who was supposed to be preparing the conquest of Parthia and the reckoning with Octavian, laid his armour aside and gave himself up entirely to pleasure. He and Cleopatra formed a private club, a little society of friends dedicated to luxurious living, which they called, with a kind of laughing self-awareness, the Society of Inimitable Livers, the company of those whose life of pleasure could not be equalled. They feasted every night, they gambled and drank and played. They roamed the city together in disguise after dark, dressed as ordinary people, servants and slaves, knocking on strangers' doors and playing pranks and getting into the sort of scrapes and quarrels that ordinary people got into. So that the great Antony was sometimes cursed and even beaten by Alexandrians who had no idea they were manhandling the master of half the world, which delighted him enormously, and delighted the Alexandrians when they found out even more, for they were a witty and irreverent people, and they rather enjoyed a Roman ruler who could take a joke. They went fishing, and there is a story that Antony, embarrassed at catching nothing while trying to impress the queen, secretly ordered divers to swim down and fasten already caught fish onto his hook, and that Cleopatra, seeing through it at once, arranged the next day for a diver of her own to fasten a salted dried fish from the market onto his line, so that Antony hauled up. Before the whole laughing party, a fish that had obviously been dead and cured for a month, a gentle, perfect puncturing of a great man's vanity by a woman who understood him completely and loved him anyway. It is, in its small way, one of the most human moments in the whole story, and it tells you why these two, for all the propaganda that would later be poured over them, seem to have genuinely delighted in each other. They were not merely using one another, though they were certainly doing that as well. They were, by every sign, in love and having, in that golden Alexandrian winter, the time of their lives. But the world does not leave such people alone for long, and the bill for a winter of pleasure always comes due. While Antony feasted in Alexandria, his neglected responsibilities in the wider world caught fire all at once. In the east, the great enemy, Parthia, seeing the Roman commander distracted and idle, went on the attack, pouring across the frontier, overrunning Syria and much of the Roman East, the very lands Antony was supposed to be governing and defending. And in the west, in Italy, a different disaster was brewing, and it involved, awkwardly, Antony's own family. For Antony, like most Roman noblemen, had a wife back in Rome, a formidable, fierce, politically ambitious woman named Fulvia, who was no one's idea of a passive spouse. While her husband dallied in Egypt, Fulvia, together with Antony's brother, had raised an actual war against Octavian in Italy, partly out of genuine political grievance over the treatment of Antony's soldiers, and partly, some said, in a bid to force the wandering Antony to come home and pay attention to his wife and his interests. That war went badly. Octavian crushed it, besieging and starving the town where Fulvia and Antony's brother had made their stand. And so Antony was dragged, at last, out of his golden Alexandrian dream, by news that his eastern provinces were being overrun by Parthians, and that his wife and brother had just lost a war against his rival at home. He tore himself away from Cleopatra and sailed west, back into the harsh machinery of Roman power, leaving the queen behind in Egypt. And she was not merely left behind, she was left carrying his children. Not long after he sailed, Cleopatra gave birth again, and this time to twins, a boy and a girl, and she gave them grand and telling names. The boy she called Alexander Helios, Alexander the sun, and the girl she called Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra the moon, sun and moon, the two great lights of heaven, a naming that announced, to anyone paying attention, that these were no ordinary royal children but the intended heirs of a cosmic destiny, the future rulers, their mother meant, of a great eastern realm. But their father was far away and would not see them for years, and for now the dream had to be folded up and put away, while the world's men settled their quarrels. When Antony reached the west, events took a turn that must have been, for Cleopatra in Alexandria, deeply painful to watch from afar. His wife Fulvia, the fierce woman who had waged war on his behalf, fell ill and died, and her death, as it happened, cleared away the awkwardness of the war she had started, and opened the way for a reconciliation between Antony and Octavian, who both understood that they were not yet ready to fight each other and needed, for the moment, to keep the peace. And that reconciliation, in the hard old Roman way, was sealed with a marriage. Octavian had a sister, a woman named Octavia, and she was, by every account, everything a Roman matron was supposed to be. Beautiful, dignified, gentle, intelligent, virtuous, loyal, universally admired and respected. Her husband had recently died, and so to bind the two rival warlords together, it was arranged that Antony should marry Octavia, the sister of his rival, and he did. Mark Antony, the lover of Cleopatra, the father of her newborn twins, married the noble Octavia in Rome, in a grand and celebrated union that all of Rome hailed as the guarantee of peace. The marriage that would hold the warring halves of the world together and prevent another civil war. For Cleopatra, waiting in Egypt with two infants who bore Antony's blood and the names of the sun and moon, it was a bitter blow both to her heart and to her plans. The man on whom she had staked her dynasty's future had married another woman, and not just any woman, but the sister of the one man in the world most likely to destroy them both. And he had done it, apparently, without a backward glance. There followed several years in which Cleopatra and Antony did not see each other at all. Antony lived in the West, and in Greece, with his admirable Roman wife Octavia, who bore him daughters, and who by all accounts loved him faithfully, and worked tirelessly to keep the peace between her husband and her brother. He seems, in these years, to have made a genuine effort to be the man Rome wanted him to be, the loyal partner, the good husband, the co-ruler of a shared world, and Cleopatra meanwhile ruled Egypt and raised her 3 children, Caesarion and the twins, and waited and watched the Roman world with the patient, clear-eyed attention she had always given it. She was in her late 20s and early 30s now, at the height of her powers, no longer the girl in the boat or the goddess on the barge, but a mature and formidable monarch who had governed a great kingdom for a decade, who had outlasted her siblings and her enemies, who had borne children to the 2 greatest Romans of the age, and who had not, whatever the years and the distance, given up the great dream. She had learned, above all, patience. She had learned that in the affairs of Rome the wheel was always turning, that alliances which looked like granite dissolved like the pearl in the cup, that the loyal husband of today could become the estranged rival of tomorrow, and that a patient player who kept her kingdom strong and her treasury full and her wits sharp would sooner or later be given another chance to play. And she was right, because the marriage of Antony and Octavia, for all the hopes pinned on it, could not paper over the truth that Antony and Octavian were 2 men who each meant, in the end, to rule the world alone, and no woman, however good, could hold that crack together forever. The peace was always temporary. And Antony's great dream, the conquest of Parthia, the glory that would make him beyond all argument the first man in the world, was still unfulfilled, still calling to him. And to pursue it he would need, once again, exactly the things that only one place and one person in all the world could give him in the quantities he required: the wealth, the grain, the ships, the harbours, and the shrewd, loyal, inexhaustible support of the Queen of Egypt. And so, in time, his eyes turned east again, and with them at last his heart and his footsteps. After some years apart, Antony came east in earnest to prepare his great war against Parthia, and he summoned Cleopatra to meet him, this time in the Syrian city of Antioch, and there whatever coldness the years and the Roman marriage had put between them, it melted away. And the 2 of them resumed their partnership, and it was now, more than ever, a partnership in the fullest sense, personal and political and dynastic all at once. Antony openly acknowledged the twins as his own children, the sun and the moon, and Cleopatra soon bore him a 3rd child, another son, whom they named Ptolemy Philadelphus, after the greatest of her ancestors. And Antony did something that would prove in the end to be political poison in Rome, though it made perfect sense in the East. He began to give Cleopatra territory, real land, whole provinces and kingdoms carved out of Rome's eastern possessions, and out of the neighbouring realms, handing them to the Queen of Egypt and to their children as their royal inheritance. Some of this was practical statecraft, rewarding a loyal and essential ally and strengthening the buffer states along a dangerous frontier, and much of it involved lands over which Roman control had always been loose, But to Roman eyes, later, when Octavian chose to describe it, it looked like a Roman general giving away the empire's hard-won provinces to a foreign woman and her half-breed children, as though the possessions of the Roman people were his private gift to bestow on his mistress, and that image, once planted, would be very hard to uproot. Antony and Cleopatra seem to have thought of it differently. They seem to have been building, together, quite deliberately, a great new Eastern power, a revived kingdom of the East centred on Egypt and Alexandria, a realm that would join Antony's Roman authority to Cleopatra's ancient wealth and legitimacy, and pass one day to their children, the sun and the moon and the little Philadelphus, and to Caesarion, the son of Caesar, alongside them. It was a grand vision, a genuine alternative to a world ruled from Rome alone, an Eastern Mediterranean empire with two monarchs at its head, who were also, now, husband and wife in an Eastern ceremony. Whatever Roman law might say about the marriage back in Italy that Antony had never bothered to end. Whether it was a beautiful dream or a reckless folly depends entirely on whether it had succeeded, and history, which is written by the winners, has mostly called it folly. But first, before any of it could be secured, Antony had to win his war, the war that would give him the military glory to match Cleopatra's wealth, the conquest of Parthia. And that war was a catastrophe. In the year 36 before the Common Era, Antony marched east at the head of an enormous army, one of the largest Rome had ever sent in that direction, perhaps 100,000 men, with Cleopatra's Egyptian wealth helping to pay for it, and he plunged into the vast, harsh, mountainous lands of the Parthian Empire, chasing the same glory that had drawn Alexander 300 years before and destroyed Crassus, another Roman general, only a generation earlier. And almost everything went wrong. Antony, impatient, advanced too fast and too far, outrunning his own supply lines and his heavy siege equipment, which he left behind with a smaller force so as to speed ahead. The Parthians, masters of a swift and merciless kind of warfare, fell upon that rear detachment and destroyed it utterly, burning the siege engines Antony needed to take the enemy cities, so that when he arrived before the great fortress he had marched all that way to capture, he had no means of breaking its walls. He besieged it hopelessly as the season turned, and then, with winter coming on and his army starving in hostile country, he was forced to do the most terrible thing a general can do, to give up, and to lead his vast army back the way it had come, in a long retreat through the mountains in the depth of winter, harried every step of the way by the Parthian horsemen who circled the plodding Roman columns like wolves, shooting them down from a distance. Day after day after day, while cold and hunger and disease did the rest. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. Antony lost a huge portion of his great army, tens of thousands of men, dead in the snow and the passes, and he himself, to his credit, shared every hardship of that dreadful march, going among his suffering soldiers, comforting them, weeping with them, showing the personal courage and warmth that made his men love him even in ruin, so that the retreat, though a catastrophe, somehow deepened rather than destroyed the devotion of the survivors. But he came out of Parthia a beaten man, his great dream of Eastern conquest in ashes, his army shattered, his prestige badly damaged, and Octavian, back in the west, took quiet note of every part of it. And when the broken remnant of the army at last struggled down out of the mountains to the coast, cold and hungry and desperate, who came to meet them, sailing east with ships full of money and clothing and food and everything the ragged survivors needed? Cleopatra, she came herself, bringing relief to Antony and to his ruined army, spending Egypt's wealth to clothe and feed and pay the freezing soldiers, standing by her partner in the very worst hour of his life. Whatever else one says about the two of them, in that moment she was not the treacherous seductress of the later Roman story. She was the ally who came, with open hands, when everyone else had failed him, and when there was nothing left to gain. And Antony, one imagines, never forgot it. From this point on, the two of them were bound together more tightly than ever, and their fates, from here to the end, would be a single fate. Let us pause here, in the middle years of their partnership, before the propaganda and the war close in, and spend a little while simply in the world the two of them made together in Alexandria, because it was, for a time, a genuinely extraordinary thing. And it is easy to lose it under the noise of the ending. Picture the court they kept in those years, in the greatest city on earth. Cleopatra ruled as a Greek queen and as an Egyptian pharaoh at once, and she wore both faces with equal ease, and this was no small feat. In the marble world of Alexandria, among the Greek-speaking elite, she was a Hellenistic monarch in the tradition of Alexander's successors, a patron of scholars and poets, at home among the philosophers of the museum, quick and learned and witty in the manner that world prized. But when she travelled up the river, into the deep ancient country of the temples, she became something else, something older and stranger and more powerful. She became the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the great mother of Egypt, the goddess of the throne and of magic and of healing and of the fertile flooding earth, worshipped not only in Egypt but across the whole Eastern world by millions of people who found in her a warmth and a nearness that the cold Olympian gods of the Greeks could not offer. Cleopatra presented herself as the new Isis, the goddess walking among her people, and she was received as such by the Egyptian priesthood and the Egyptian people, who had ruled by god-kings for 3,000 years and who understood their monarch as a bridge between heaven and earth. And Antony, beside her, took up the matching role. He presented himself as the new Dionysus, the god of wine and abundance and joyful release, the divine companion of the goddess, so that the two of them, appearing together before their Eastern subjects, were not merely a king and a queen, but a divine pair, a god and a goddess reigning together over a golden realm. To modern ears this can sound like mere vanity or delusion, but it was, in its own world, a serious and shrewd act of statecraft, a language of power that the peoples of the East understood in their bones, and it bound millions of ordinary people to the pair in a way that no mere administration could. And beneath the divine imagery was a real and functioning kingdom, well run. Egypt in these years was prosperous. The grain came in, the Nile mostly behaved, the harbours were busy, the treasury was full, so full that it could fund armies and fleets and relieve a broken Roman host and still gather the greatest private hoard of wealth in the world. Cleopatra attended to the actual business of ruling with a care that many monarchs never bother to show, and the documents that survive from her reign. The decrees and the orders show a hand that paid attention to detail, to taxes and exemptions, and the fair working of the machinery of the state. And around the royal pair grew a family, the 4 children who were the whole point of the great dream, Caesarion, the eldest, the son of Caesar, being raised as a prince and a future king, and the 3 younger children of Antony, the sun and the moon and little Philadelphus, growing up in the palace by the sea as the intended heirs of a joined Eastern world. It is worth holding this picture clearly, this golden middle passage, because it is the thing that was lost, and because it shows that the story of Cleopatra is not only a story of seduction and death, but of a genuine, ambitious, and for a time successful attempt to build something new, a great Eastern power, centred on the oldest and richest kingdom in the world, ruled by a partnership of Roman strength and Egyptian wealth and legitimacy, that might have stood as a real and lasting counterweight to a world ruled from Rome alone. Whether it could ever truly have endured, whether the tide of Roman power could have been held back for long by any arrangement, we cannot know, because it was not allowed to happen. Octavian and the legions of the West saw to that. But it was not a foolish dream, or not only a foolish dream. It was a bold and imaginative bid to bend the course of history, made by 2 people with the wealth and the will and the daring to attempt it, and for a handful of years, in the lamplit palaces of Alexandria, with a great lighthouse burning out at the harbour mouth, and the children growing and the treasure piling in the vaults, it very nearly looked as though it might come true. There is a particular quality to a golden age, which is that the people living inside it rarely know that is what it is. They are too busy living, feasting, quarrelling, planning, loving, to see that they are standing at the very top of the wheel at the highest point it will ever carry them, and that from here the only way the wheel can turn is down. Cleopatra, clever as she was, and clear-eyed as she was about the danger from Rome, surely felt the shadow of Octavian growing across the Western Sea, even in these good years. She was not a woman who fooled herself. But she could not have known the exact shape the ending would take. The desertions and the strange muted battle at Actium, and the ropes at the high window and the basket of figs. In these middle years she still had everything. Her throne, her wealth, her city, her children, her god-companion beside her, her divine role among her people, and time, or so it must have seemed, still stretching ahead. And so let us leave her here for a moment. At the height of the wheel, a queen and a goddess in the greatest city in the world. Before we follow the story down its long slope to the end, because everyone deserves to be remembered, sometimes, not only in their fall but in their glory, and this, the lamplit court by the sea, the divine pair, the golden children, the full treasury and the burning lighthouse, and the whole ancient wealth of the Nile flowing quietly through her hands. This was Cleopatra's glory, the high still noon of her long and extraordinary life, and it is a good and peaceful place to rest for a while, before the shadows lengthen. Now the story becomes more and more a duel between two men across the whole width of the Mediterranean, with Cleopatra bound to one of them, and it is a duel fought at least as much with words and images as with swords. A war of propaganda, and it is worth understanding it clearly, because the picture of Cleopatra that has come down through 2,000 years was very largely forged in this war by the side that won. In the west sat Octavian, cold, patient, physically unimpressive, no soldier, but a political genius of a kind the world had rarely seen, a master of image and message, and the slow, relentless accumulation of advantage. He controlled Rome and Italy, the ancient heart of things, and he controlled therefore the story that Romans told themselves. And he set about, deliberately, systematically, over years, to destroy Antony not on the battlefield, where Antony was the better man, but in the imagination of Rome. He painted Antony as a man lost, ruined, unmanned, a great Roman soldier who had been bewitched and enslaved by a foreign sorceress, an Eastern queen who had stolen him from his virtuous Roman wife Octavia, Octavian's own dear sister, and who had drowned his Roman virtue in Eastern luxury and vice. He painted Cleopatra as the villain of the whole world, a scheming, insatiable, decadent Oriental temptress, drunk on wine and power, who dreamed of nothing less than the conquest of Rome itself, who meant to bring her Egyptian idols and her eunuchs into the Roman Forum, and rule the free people of Rome as her slaves from a throne on the ruins of the Republic. It was a brilliant and largely dishonest campaign, and it worked, because it played on things Romans already feared. They feared kings, they feared the strange and luxurious East, they feared powerful women who had no place in their idea of proper order, and here was a single figure onto whom all three fears could be loaded at once. Antony, for his part, was no match for Octavian in this contest, and he made it worse by handing his enemy gift after gift. After the Parthian disaster, he did win a real success a couple of years later, marching not against Parthia itself, but against its ally, the kingdom of Armenia, which he overran and whose king he captured. It was a genuine victory, and Antony chose to celebrate it, and here he made one of his gravest mistakes. A victorious Roman general celebrated his triumph in Rome, in a sacred and ancient ceremony, parading through the streets of the capital to the temple on the Capitoline Hill. That was the immemorial custom, the highest honour of Roman life, and it belonged to Rome and to Rome alone. Antony celebrated his triumph in Alexandria. He paraded his captives and his spoils not through the Roman Forum, but through the streets of the Egyptian capital, and he did it before Cleopatra, who sat enthroned to receive him like a monarch receiving a returning champion. To Romans this was an outrage close to sacrilege, a Roman triumph stolen from the gods of Rome and given to a foreign queen. And Octavian made sure every Roman heard about it and understood exactly what it meant. And then came the act that Octavian would use, above all others, to inflame Rome to war, the great ceremony that history calls the Donations of Alexandria. In a magnificent public spectacle in the heart of the city, Antony and Cleopatra seated themselves on golden thrones set on a silver platform, with the children on lesser thrones below them, Cleopatra robed as the goddess Isis, and before the assembled crowds Antony proclaimed the division of the Eastern world among Cleopatra and her children. He declared Cleopatra to be Queen of Kings, and her son Caesarion to be King of Kings, and, most explosively of all, he publicly proclaimed that Caesarion was the true and legitimate son of Julius Caesar, Caesar's own blood. Then he parcelled out kingdoms to the children. To the little son Alexander Helios, he gave Armenia and the lands beyond toward Parthia, to the little moon Cleopatra Selene. He gave lands in the west of Africa. To the small Ptolemy Philadelphus he gave Syria and the lands of the Near East, and over them all he set Cleopatra and Caesarion. Consider for a moment how this landed in Rome, and how Octavian made it land. Here was a Roman commander giving away vast Roman territories, provinces the Roman people had bled to win, to a foreign queen and her children as if they were his to give. And here, worse, was a public declaration that Caesarion was the true son of Julius Caesar, which was a dagger aimed straight at Octavian himself. Because Octavian's entire claim to power, his name, his fortune, his hold on Caesar's veterans, all of it rested on his being Caesar's heir, Caesar's adopted son. If there was a living son of Caesar's actual blood, an older boy, growing up as a king in Alexandria, then Octavian's whole position rested on a kind of fraud, and there were plenty of people who would prefer the real son to the adopted one. So the declaration about Caesarion was not merely an insult, it was potentially a claim on Rome itself, on Caesar's inheritance, and Octavian could not let it stand. From this point, war between the two of them was no longer a possibility to be managed, but a certainty to be prepared for, and both sides began, in earnest, to gather their strength for the reckoning that would decide who ruled the world. The final break came in stages, each one making the next inevitable. Antony, now living wholly in the East with Cleopatra, at last formally divorced the good and patient Octavia, sending her away from his house, and in doing so he threw away the last thread of connection to Octavian, and delivered his enemy a perfect gift, because Octavia was beloved in Rome, the very picture of the wronged and faithful Roman wife. And her public humiliation turned even more Roman hearts against her faithless husband and the foreign woman who had taken him. Octavian played the injury for all it was worth, presenting his sister as the innocent victim of Cleopatra's spell, and himself, therefore, as a wronged brother and a defender of Roman honour. Then Octavian did something outrageous, illegal, and enormously effective. He learned that Antony's will was kept in Rome, in the safekeeping of the sacred priestesses called the Vestal Virgins, whose trust was one of the most inviolable things in Roman life. Octavian went to them and demanded the will. They refused rightly, so he took it from them by force, which was very nearly a sacrilege, and he carried it into the Senate, and he read it aloud to the people of Rome, or read out the parts that suited him. And whether the document truly said what he claimed, or whether he twisted or invented, we can never fully know. But what he told Rome it contained was devastating. He said that Antony's will confirmed the gifts of Roman land to Cleopatra's children, that it declared Caesarion the son of Caesar, and, most damning of all to Roman feeling, that Antony had asked that when he died, even if he died in Rome, his body be sent to Alexandria to be buried beside Cleopatra. This last detail struck home hardest of all, because it seemed to prove that Antony's heart no longer belonged to Rome at all, that he wished to lie in death not in the sacred soil of Italy, but in the arms of the foreign queen, in her eastern city, that he had, in the deepest sense, gone over entirely to the other side and stopped being a Roman. The reading of the will was the point of no return. A wave of anger and fear swept Rome. And now Octavian revealed the true cleverness of his whole long campaign, the reason he had spent years building Cleopatra into a monster. He did not declare war on Antony. To declare war on Antony would have been to start another Roman civil war, Roman against Roman, the very thing the exhausted, traumatized people of Rome dreaded most, and it would have forced every Roman to choose sides against a fellow Roman, which many were reluctant to do. So instead, Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. He declared war on the foreign queen, the Eastern threat, the sorceress who menaced Rome, and he framed the whole coming conflict not as Roman against Roman, but as Rome against Egypt, West against East, freedom against Oriental despotism. The virtuous sons of Italy against a decadent foreign woman and her idols. Antony was cast merely as her deluded slave, a good Roman lost, whom Octavian was regretfully obliged to fight only because he had chained himself to Rome's enemy. It was a masterpiece of political framing, and it allowed Octavian to rally all of Italy and the West behind him in what looked like a patriotic, almost holy, war of national defence, rather than the naked grab for sole power that it actually was. Both sides now gathered their forces on a scale the world had rarely seen. Antony and Cleopatra assembled an enormous host, drawing on all the resources of the East, hundreds of warships, many of them huge, and tens of thousands of soldiers, and the wealth of Egypt to pay for all of it. For Cleopatra's treasure was, as always, the golden foundation on which the whole Eastern effort rested. They moved their great force west, across to Greece, to meet Octavian's coming invasion, and they made their base along the western coast of Greece, a vast camp and a vast fleet gathered in the gulfs and bays there, waiting, and here, in the long tense months before the battle. The deepest weakness in Antony's position began to show, and it was not a weakness of ships or men, but of the heart. Cleopatra had come in person, with her fleet and her money, and she insisted on staying, on being present at the council of war, on being part of every decision, because it was her wealth funding the enterprise and her kingdom's future at stake. And she did not intend to sit quietly in Egypt while the men decided her fate. But her presence was a constant, grinding problem, because Antony's cause depended heavily on Roman soldiers and Roman officers, and to those Romans, the sight of the foreign queen at the heart of their war council was exactly the thing Octavian's propaganda had warned them of, proof that their general was indeed under the woman's spell, that they were fighting not for a Roman cause, but for the ambitions of an Egyptian. Antony's Roman supporters begged him, again and again, to send Cleopatra back to Egypt, to make the war look like a Roman war, to free himself from the poisonous image Octavian had painted. And Antony, torn between his Roman officers and the queen whose money and will and love held his whole enterprise together, could not bring himself to send her away, and she would not go. So she stayed, and the doubt and the division spread through his camp like damp through a wall, and some of his most important Roman supporters, seeing which way the wind was blowing and unwilling to fight their own countrymen for the sake of an Egyptian queen, began quietly to slip away, deserting Antony and going over to Octavian, and taking their knowledge of his plans with them. Long before the fleets ever met, the war was being lost, slowly, in the hearts of the men who were supposed to fight it. The great reckoning came in the late summer of the year 31 before the Common Era, off a headland on the western coast of Greece called Actium, and it gave its name to one of the most famous and most decisive battles in all of history, though it was, in the actual fighting, a strangely muted and almost anticlimactic affair, the collapse of a cause rather than a clash of titans. Octavian had a brilliant admiral, a boyhood friend named Agrippa, one of the finest naval commanders Rome ever produced. And it was Agrippa, more than Octavian, who won the campaign. While Antony's huge fleet and army sat in their bases along the Greek coast, Agrippa's ships ranged the sea around them, seizing the islands and the harbours and the supply routes, one by one, until, slowly, methodically, they had drawn a noose around Antony's position and cut off the flow of grain and supplies that his great host needed to survive. Antony's enormous army and fleet, penned into their camps and bays, began to starve. Disease broke out in the crowded, unhealthy camps, malaria and dysentery, and swept through the ranks, killing rowers and soldiers by the thousand, so that Antony's great fleet, magnificent on paper, found itself short of the healthy men needed to row and fight the ships. Morale rotted along with the supplies. More officers deserted, some of them men of the highest rank and Antony's oldest friends, slipping away to Octavian's camp, until Antony, once so beloved and trusted, grew suspicious and bitter. And the sickness in his cause spread from the body to the spirit. Trapped, starving, outmaneuvered, his position crumbling by the day, Antony faced a grim choice, and his council of war split over it. Some urged him to abandon the fleet, to burn the ships he could not man, and to march the army inland, away from the coast, into the mountains and open country where his veteran legions might still fight and win a land campaign on ground of their own choosing. But Cleopatra, and those who agreed with her, argued for the sea, for using the great fleet to break out, to smash through the blockade and, if the day went against them, to escape by water back toward Egypt, where the war could be continued with Egypt's wealth intact. In the end, Antony chose the sea, and it is likely that Cleopatra's counsel, and the simple fact that her treasure was aboard her ships and she meant to keep it safe, weighed heavily in the choice. So on a September morning, Antony's fleet rowed out of its confined anchorage to give battle to Octavian's ships waiting in the open water beyond, and Cleopatra's own squadron, with the great war chest of the campaign aboard, waited behind the fighting line, near the rear. What exactly happened in the battle has been argued over ever since, because the two sides told very different stories, and the truth is buried under the propaganda of the winner. What is clear is that the fighting was hard, but never decisive, the two fleets grinding against each other through the middle of the day without either breaking the other. And then, at a certain moment, whether by a pre-arranged plan to break out and save the fleet, as the kinder reading has it, or in a sudden failure of nerve, as Octavian's version insisted, Cleopatra's squadron of some 60 ships raised their sails, which warships did not do in the thick of battle, unless they meant to run, and drove straight through a gap in the fighting lines and out to the open sea beyond, turning south, running for Egypt, the war chest and the queen escaping the closing trap. And Antony, seeing her go, did the thing that ruined him forever in the eyes of history and Rome. He abandoned his own fleet, and his own men still fighting and dying, transferred to a fast smaller ship, and followed her. He broke off from the battle and sailed after Cleopatra, leaving his great fleet leaderless behind him. To his enemies, and to many since, it was the ultimate proof of everything Octavian had said, the great Roman general throwing away his honour, his fleet, his army, and the mastery of the world, all to chase a fleeing woman, a man so enslaved by love or lust that he deserted his own men in the heat of battle. Kinder historians have suggested it was a planned withdrawal that went wrong, that the aim all along had been to preserve the fleet and the treasure and fight another day, and that only a part of the fleet managed to break free. But whatever the intention, the effect was catastrophe. Leaderless, hemmed in and hopeless, the ships Antony left behind fought on for a while and then surrendered, and within days the great land army he had also left behind, waiting for a leader who never returned, seeing itself abandoned and offered generous terms, went over entirely to Octavian without a real fight. In the space of a few days, without a truly great battle ever being fought. Antony's enormous power in the east simply evaporated, his fleet taken, his army gone over to the enemy, his prestige destroyed, his cause finished. He and Cleopatra sailed back to Egypt not as the rulers of a great Eastern empire, but as two fugitives fleeing a lost war, with almost nothing left but the walls of Alexandria and the treasure in the hold, and the knowledge that Octavian, now the undisputed master of the entire Roman world, would come after them, in his own cold time, to finish what he had begun. The last year of their lives, back in Alexandria, has a strange twilight quality to it, a long, slow sunset over the two of them, and over the whole ancient world of independent kingdoms that was dying with them. They had lost, and they knew they had lost, and yet Octavian did not come at once. He had his own affairs to settle, a mutiny among his soldiers, the securing of the West, the careful arrangement of his coming victory, and so for many months the doomed pair waited in their city, knowing the end was coming but not when, and the two of them responded to that knowledge in very different ways, each according to their nature. Antony, the great warm, reckless soldier, fell into a deep despair. The collapse of a man whose whole life had been built on being admired and loved and victorious, and who now found himself beaten, deserted by his friends, his glory turned to mockery, his cause a ruin. For a time he withdrew from everyone, even from Cleopatra, and built himself a little house out on a spit of land in the harbour, and lived there alone, brooding, calling himself after a famous hermit of old who had hated all mankind, telling himself, and anyone who would listen, that he too had learned what human friendship and gratitude were worth. It was the sulk of a broken man, and it did not last, because Antony was not really built for solitude any more than for defeat, and in time he came back into the city and back to Cleopatra, and the two of them, with a kind of defiant gallantry, resolved to spend whatever time was left to them as they had spent their best days, in feasting and in company, and in the pleasures of the greatest city in the world. They had once, in their golden years, founded that laughing society of pleasure, the Inimitable Livers. Now, in the shadow of the end, they founded a new club, and they gave it a darker and braver name, the Companions in Death, or those who would die together, a fellowship whose members pledged to share the same fate and go down together when the time came. And they feasted more lavishly than ever, as though to pack a lifetime of living into the little that remained. There is something both foolish and magnificent in it, this determination to meet ruin with a banquet rather than with tears, and it is one of the reasons that these two, for all their failures, have never lost their hold on the human imagination. Cleopatra, though, was made of harder and cleverer stuff than her lover, and while Antony brooded and then feasted, she was thinking, coldly and clearly, as she had always thought, about the future, about what could still be saved, about her children, and about the manner of her own end. She did not intend to be led in chains through the streets of Rome. That, above all, she was resolved to prevent, for she knew exactly what Octavian would want, a Roman triumph, that great parade of victory through the capital, with the captured foreign queen, the monster of his propaganda, walking in chains behind his chariot for the mob to jeer at, before being strangled in a cell as the custom was, the final humiliation of the woman he had spent years turning into the enemy of Rome. Cleopatra would die 100 deaths before she would give him that. And so she began, characteristically, to prepare on every front at once. She gathered her enormous treasure, the accumulated wealth of the Ptolemies, gold and silver and pearls and ebony and ivory, into a great tomb, a mausoleum she had built for herself near a temple in the city, a strong high building. And she had it filled with the treasure, and also, deliberately, with firewood and kindling and everything that would burn, so that if it came to the worst she could destroy herself and the whole fabulous treasure together in one great fire, denying Octavian the prize he wanted most, for she understood that her treasure was one of the few pieces of leverage she had left. Octavian needed that gold, desperately, to pay his soldiers and secure his power, and a queen who could burn it all was a queen he could not simply crush without a thought. And she is said to have studied in these final months, with the cool curiosity that had always marked her, the various means of death, testing different poisons and venoms, watching, it was said, to learn which brought the gentlest and surest end, the death with the least pain and the least disfigurement, so that when her own time came she would know exactly how to meet it, quickly, cleanly, and on her own terms. She also thought of her children, and tried to save what she could of them and of her dynasty. She took her eldest son, Caesarion, the son of Caesar, now a teenager and the greatest dynastic danger to Octavian, and she sent him away, south and east, with a tutor and a store of treasure, toward the coast and the routes to India, hoping to get him beyond Octavian's reach and preserve at least one heir, one thread of the great dream, somewhere in the wide world. And she opened negotiations with the approaching conqueror, sending messengers, feeling out terms, trying every avenue her long experience of Roman men had taught her. She offered to abdicate, to give up her throne, if only her children might be allowed to inherit some part of it and her line continue. Octavian, for his part, played his own careful game, sending back soothing, ambiguous answers, encouraging her to hope, above all encouraging her to keep her treasure intact and not to burn it or herself, because he wanted that gold. And he wanted, more than the gold, to take her alive for his triumph. So the two of them, the aging queen in her city and the cold young master of the world drawing slowly nearer, circled each other through those last months in a subtle, deadly game of offers and hints and half-promises, each trying to read and outplay the other, while Antony feasted and the doomed city waited, and the end came on, step by quiet step. In the summer of the year 30 before the Common Era, Octavian at last came for Egypt, marching on Alexandria from the east while another of his forces closed in from the west. And the final act began. Antony, for one last time, tried to be the soldier he had always been. When Octavian's army approached the city, Antony led out what cavalry he still had and actually won a small sharp skirmish against the enemy's advance guard, driving them back, and he came riding back into the city, flushed with the old fire. One last taste of the victory that had been the whole meaning of his life. But it was a candle flaring up before it goes out. The next day, when he drew up his remaining forces, his fleet and his cavalry, for the real battle, the end revealed itself with a cruelty that seems almost designed. His fleet rowed out toward Octavian's ships, and then, in full view of Antony watching from the shore, his ships raised their oars in salute to the enemy and went over, whole and entire, to Octavian, joining their squadrons together without a blow. And then his cavalry, seeing the fleet gone, turned and deserted too, riding over to the enemy. In a single morning, without a fight, the last of Antony's forces abandoned him, and he was left standing, a general with no army, betrayed, as it seemed to him, by everyone, and he cried out, in his rage and grief, that he had been sold to his enemies. And, worse, some whisper reached him, or grew in his own tormented mind, that Cleopatra herself had arranged it, that the queen had betrayed him at the last to make her own peace with the conqueror. Whether he truly believed it, or only feared it, we cannot know, but he raged through the palace like a wounded animal, and Cleopatra, terrified of him in that state, fled from him, and shut herself up in her great tomb, the mausoleum with its treasure and its kindling, and barred the doors, and, to end the danger and perhaps to soften his fury with grief, she sent him word that she was dead. It was a lie, and it was a fatal one. When the message reached Antony that Cleopatra had died, everything in him simply gave way. The betrayal he could rage against, a world without her he could not face at all. The whole long structure of his life had collapsed, his glory, his army, his honour, and now, as he believed, the woman for whom he had given all the rest, and he saw no reason left to live another hour. He was a Roman soldier, and there was one honourable answer left to a Roman soldier who had lost everything, and he took it. He called for a trusted servant whom he had long ago made swear to kill him if the need ever came, and he asked the man to strike him dead. But the servant, unable to kill the master he loved, turned the sword instead upon himself, and fell dead at Antony's feet, and Antony, looking down at that last act of devotion, said that his servant had shown him what he himself must do, and he took his own sword and drove it into his belly, and fell. But even his death was denied the clean swift mercy he had hoped for. The wound, though mortal, did not kill him at once, and he lay there bleeding and in agony, begging those around him to finish him, and no one would. And as he lay dying slowly on the floor, word came to him that had he only waited an hour would have stopped his hand entirely. Cleopatra was not dead after all. She was alive, in her tomb, and Antony, hearing it, dying, thought no longer of his own pain, but only of getting to her, of seeing her one last time, and he begged his attendants to carry him to her. So they lifted the great broken bleeding man and bore him through the streets to the mausoleum. But Cleopatra, in her terror of capture, had barred the heavy doors and would not open them even for him, for fear that Octavian's soldiers would rush in behind. So she and her 2 waiting women let down ropes from a high window, and they tied the ropes about the dying Antony, and the 3 women, straining with all their strength, hauled the heavy, wounded, blood-soaked man up the outside of the wall and in through the high window, the hardest and most pitiful labour, the queen who had drunk pearls now hauling her dying lover up a wall by a rope with her own hands, and everyone who saw it wept. And they laid him down inside, and Cleopatra tore her clothes and beat her breast and covered herself with his blood, and called him her husband and her lord and her emperor. And there, at last, in her arms, in the tomb she had built for herself, Mark Antony died. He had lost the world and thrown away his honour, and been deserted by all his friends and all his men, and he died believing, until nearly the last moment, that even she had betrayed him. And yet he died reaching for her, carried to her side by his own last wish, and she held him as he went. Whatever the propaganda of Rome would make of the 2 of them, and it would make a great deal, there was, in that terrible ending, something that no propaganda could quite explain away, and that has kept the world half in love with their story for 2,000 years, that at the very end, with everything else stripped away, when there was nothing left to gain and no audience left to impress, they still simply wanted to be together, and were. With Antony dead, Cleopatra was alone, the last of her line still standing, shut in her tomb with her treasure and her grief, and Octavian, now truly master of the world, wanted 2 things from her above all, and they were in tension with each other. He wanted the treasure, intact, unburned, to pay his troops and fund his new order. And he wanted the queen herself, alive, unharmed, to walk in his triumph through the streets of Rome. A dead Cleopatra was worth far less to him than a living one, and a burned treasury was a disaster. So his first task was to take her before she could destroy either herself or the gold, and he set about it with the cold cleverness that was his whole nature. He sent men to the mausoleum to negotiate with her, to keep her talking, to hold her attention with soothing words and vague promises of mercy toward her and her children, while others found a way in. And while she stood at a barred lower door, parleying with one of Octavian's officers, keeping up the careful diplomatic dance she had played for months, another officer, with a couple of men, set a ladder against the high window through which the dying Antony had been hauled, and climbed in behind her unseen and came down into the tomb. One of her women saw them and cried out that she was taken, and Cleopatra, understanding in an instant that she was trapped, snatched at a small dagger she carried to stab herself then and there. But the officer sprang forward and caught her arm and took the blade away, and searched her for poison, and so she was seized, alive and unharmed, exactly as Octavian had wished, and her treasure with her. She was now a prisoner, closely watched, guarded day and night by men whose entire purpose was to keep her alive for the triumph, to prevent, at all costs, the very thing she was most determined to do. She was allowed to bury Antony, and she did so with royal splendour and terrible grief, and then she collapsed, worn out with sorrow and with the wounds she had given herself in her mourning, feverish and ill, and for a while she seemed as though she might die of grief alone, and cheat Octavian that way, and she may even have hoped to. But Octavian would not allow it. His men tended her, watched her, kept her alive, and, it is said, he sent word that if she harmed herself he would take a terrible revenge on her children, and that threat above all held her hand. For whatever else she was a mother, and her children were now hostages to her survival. And then Octavian came to see her himself. It is one of the strange, quiet, unforgettable scenes at the end of the ancient world. The cold young conqueror, master of everything, come to look upon his most famous captive, the woman he had spent a decade turning into the monster of his propaganda, now a grieving, ill, defeated prisoner in a bare room, and the aging queen, near 40 now, worn by sorrow, seeing at last, up close, the man who had destroyed her whole world and everyone she loved. What passed between them the ancient writers describe in different ways, but the essential truth of it seems to be this: that Cleopatra, even now, even broken, tried, one last time, the arts that had won Caesar and Antony, the charm, the appeal, the careful management of a powerful Roman man, and that Octavian, alone among the great Romans of her life, was entirely immune to them. He was not a man of appetite or sentiment or grand gesture. He was a man of calculation, and he had already calculated exactly what he wanted from her, which was that she lived long enough to be shown in Rome, and no charm on earth was going to move him from it. He answered her gently, reassured her about her safety and her children, told her to be of good cheer, and left, and she understood, watching him go, everything that his soft, careful words were designed to hide. She understood that he had not been moved at all, that his kindness was the kindness a man shows to a valuable possession he means to keep in good condition, and that his true purpose was fixed and unchangeable. And soon her understanding was confirmed from within his own camp, for one of his officers, whether out of pity or by Octavian's own subtle design, let her know the truth plainly, that in a very few days she and her children were to be sent away to Rome, ahead of the conqueror, to be kept and displayed, and that the whole show of mercy was only meant to keep her quiet and alive until then. Now, she knew, now the last shred of hope and ambiguity was gone, and the thing she had feared above all others, above death itself, stood plainly before her. The ships to Rome, the chains, the parade through the jeering streets, the Queen of Egypt led as a spectacle behind the chariot of the man who had murdered her world, and then the cell, and the strangler. She had spent her whole life refusing to be anyone's possession, refusing to be led, outthinking and outmanoeuvring every man and every trap the world had set for her, and she was not going to end as a decoration in Octavian's triumph. She had prepared for this, long ago, in the calm study of poisons and painless deaths. Now she made her final plan, the last and most private and most perfectly executed act of a lifetime of bold and secret acts, and she set about, with all her old cleverness, to deceive her watchers one final time, and to slip through the fingers of the master of the world into the one freedom he could not take from her. She moved carefully, and she moved as a queen. She asked Octavian's permission to visit Antony's tomb one last time, and it was granted, and she went, and poured out her grief over the grave of the man she had loved and lost, and decked it with flowers, and then she returned to her rooms, and bathed, and dressed herself in her finest royal robes, all her ornaments, the full regalia of the Queen of Egypt, as though for a great occasion, which, in a sense, it was. And she ordered a magnificent meal to be prepared and brought to her, a last feast in the manner of the inimitable livers and the companions in death, and she ate it with her two most faithful waiting women, the two who had been with her through everything, and who had chosen, freely, to share her fate to the end. And then, by the plan she had laid, a countryman came to the guarded door carrying a basket, and the guards, seeing only a simple man with a basket of figs, ripe country figs, checked it, and found nothing but fruit, and let him bring it in, and thought nothing of it, which was the whole point. For hidden among the figs, or so the most famous version of the story has always held, coiled beneath the leaves, was an asp, a small venomous Egyptian snake whose bite brought a death that was said to be swift and painless, and even, in a strange way, sacred, for the serpent was an emblem of Egyptian royalty and divinity, the very cobra that reared on the crown of the pharaohs, so that to die by its bite was to die as a queen and a goddess of Egypt, not as a Roman captive. When all was ready, Cleopatra wrote a letter, sealed it, and sent it to Octavian, and in it she made one last request, the only one that still mattered to her, that she be buried beside Antony. Then she sent everyone away except her two women, and she did what she had prepared to do. When Octavian received her letter and understood at once what it meant, he sent men running to her rooms, but they came too late. They burst in and found the Queen of Egypt lying dead upon her golden couch, robed and crowned in all her royal splendour, arranged with perfect dignity, as though asleep or as though enthroned in death, beautiful and terrible and utterly beyond his reach at last. One of her 2 faithful women lay dead at her feet. The other, dying, was still on her feet, swaying. Adjusting the diadem upon her dead mistress's brow, setting the crown straight one final time so that her queen should be perfect even in death. And when one of the horrified Romans cried out, asking whether this was well done, the dying woman answered that it was indeed well done, and fitting for the descendant of so many kings, and then she too sank down and died beside her queen. The exact means of her death was never entirely certain even to those who found her. Some said there were 2 tiny marks upon her arm. The bite of the snake, though the snake itself was never clearly found. Some said she had used a poison hidden in a hollow comb or ornament. But the story of the asp, the royal serpent of Egypt, took hold at once and never let go, because it was, somehow, exactly right, the Queen of Egypt choosing to die by the sacred symbol of Egyptian kinship, denying Rome its prize with the emblem of her own crown. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years, since she was 18. She had outwitted her siblings, charmed and bound to herself the 2 greatest Romans of the age, borne 4 children, governed the richest kingdom in the world through decades of danger, and gambled again and again for the highest stakes there were, and at the very end, cornered and defeated and utterly alone, she had found a way to win the one last thing she cared about, which was to leave the world on her own terms, a queen to the final breath, and to cheat Octavian of his triumph. And cheat him she did. When Octavian came and looked upon her lying dead in her royal robes, even that cold man, the ancient writers say, felt a pang, a grudging admiration, an anger at being outwitted at the last, and a kind of awe. He had wanted her alive above almost anything, the crown jewel of his victory, the foreign monster to be paraded in chains, and she had slipped away from him into a death so composed and so magnificent that it turned the very moment of his total victory into something that felt, obscurely, like a defeat. He did the one gracious thing left to do. The thing she had asked in her letter, he ordered that she be buried with full royal honours and laid to rest beside Mark Antony, so that the 2 of them, who had wished to lie together, did lie together at last, in her city, by the sea, under the great lighthouse, their tomb somewhere in Alexandria, its exact place now lost, swallowed by the centuries and perhaps by the sea itself, so that no one today can say where the last queen of Egypt sleeps. With Cleopatra dead, the ending came quickly for everything she had been and everything she had built, and it is a quiet, sad, methodical ending, the tidying up that a conqueror does after the great drama is over. There was still one loose thread that Octavian could not leave hanging, and it was the most dangerous one of all, Caesarion, the boy Cleopatra had sent away toward the east and India in the hope of saving him, the son of Julius Caesar, the one living person whose very existence was a standing threat to Octavian, whose whole power rested on being Caesar's only son. Octavian could not permit 2 Caesars in the world. The boy was pursued, and by one account was betrayed by the very tutor who was supposed to be guiding him to safety, lured back with false promises, and when he was brought into Octavian's hands, the decision was cold and simple. One of Octavian's advisers is said to have murmured that it was not good to have too many Caesars, a grim little play on words, and the boy, Cleopatra's firstborn, 17 years old, the last hope of the union of Egypt and Rome, was put to death. With him died the direct male line of both the Ptolemies and in blood of Caesar himself. And the great dream that Cleopatra had built her life around, the dream of her children ruling a joined world, was extinguished. Her 3 younger children, the sun and the moon and little Philadelphus, the children of Antony, were spared, for they were no threat, and they were taken to Rome, and there, in a turn that is one of the most unexpectedly gentle things in the whole hard story, they were raised by Octavia, the good and faithful Roman wife whom Antony had cast aside for their mother. Octavia, who had every reason to hate Cleopatra, took Cleopatra's orphan children into her own home and raised them alongside her own, with kindness, as if they were hers. The two boys fade from history soon after and probably died young. But the daughter, Cleopatra Selene, the little moon, lived and grew up and was married by Octavian to a learned and cultured African king, and became a queen in her own right in a kingdom in the west of North Africa, and had children of her own, so that a thread of Cleopatra's blood, and even her name, ran on for a generation or two more in the royal houses of the ancient world, a faint far echo of the great queen, before it too faded away. As for Egypt, the ancient, fabulous 3,000-year-old kingdom of the pharaohs, it simply ceased to be a kingdom at all. Octavian did not even make it an ordinary Roman province, governed in the usual way. He took it as a personal possession, a private domain of the ruler of Rome, so jealously guarded and so important that for centuries afterward no Roman senator was even permitted to set foot in Egypt without the emperor's express permission. For whoever controlled Egypt controlled the grain that fed Rome, and no emperor would ever risk letting a rival get his hands on that lever again. The immense treasure of the Ptolemies, the hoard Cleopatra had gathered in her tomb, and had not, in the end, been able to burn, flowed to Octavian, and it was so vast that when he brought it back to Rome, it is said the flood of Egyptian gold and wealth caused interest rates across the whole Roman world to collapse, and the price of land to soar. The entire economy of the Mediterranean shifting under the weight of a single dead queen's treasury. And that treasure, and the peace that came with the end of 100 years of Roman civil war, allowed Octavian to do what all the ambition of Caesar and Antony had failed to do. To make himself, securely and permanently, the sole master of the Roman world, and to found, in place of the old broken republic, a new order, an empire, with himself as its first emperor. He took in time a new and reverent name, a name that meant something like the revered one, the majestic one, and the world came to know him by it. Augustus. He would rule for more than 40 years, long and cannily, and he is remembered as one of the most successful rulers in all of history, the founder of the Roman Empire that would shape the Western world for the next 500 years and cast its shadow for 2,000. And it is one of the quiet ironies of the whole story that the Roman Empire, that towering thing, was founded, in a sense, on the wealth of Egypt and on the defeat of Cleopatra, that the last independent queen of the old world paid, with her kingdom and her treasure and her life, for the foundation of the empire that replaced it. Her death is often taken by historians as the very moment when one age ended and another began, the last flicker of the old world of Alexander's successors, the Greek kingdoms of the East, going out and the long Roman imperial day beginning. She was the last pharaoh. After 3,000 years, after Cleopatra, no one ever again ruled Egypt as an independent monarch of its own. The crown of the pharaohs, worn by gods and god-kings since before the pyramids, passed with her and was never worn again. And that, more or less, is the life, from the winter of her birth in the marble palace to the golden couch and the royal serpent, 39 years in which one woman touched and altered the fate of the whole ancient world. But there is a last thing worth sitting with, gently, before we let her go, and it is the strange afterlife of Cleopatra, the way she has been remembered, because the Cleopatra who lives in the world's imagination is very largely not the woman whose life we have just followed, but a creature made by her enemies. Remember that almost everything written about her in the ancient world was written by Romans, and written after her death, in the reign of the very man who had destroyed her and who had spent a decade building her into a monster to justify it. The Cleopatra of legend, the insatiable seductress, the drunken, scheming, decadent oriental temptress who ensnared good Roman men and threatened to topple Rome, is in large part Octavian's Cleopatra, the character he invented for his propaganda, handed down the centuries and elaborated by poets and playwrights and painters, each generation adding its own fantasies, until the real woman was almost completely buried under the legend of the fatal beauty. And it is worth at the last setting a little of that legend aside and looking at what the woman herself, as best we can tell, actually was. She was, first and above all, not primarily a seductress at all, but a ruler, and by the standards of her own poisonous dynasty a remarkably able and serious one, who governed a great and complicated kingdom for 21 years, managed its economy and its grain and its coinage and its many peoples with skill, and kept Egypt independent and prosperous and, for a time, powerful, in an age when Rome was swallowing every other kingdom around the sea. She was extraordinarily learned, fluent in many languages, at home in the greatest centre of knowledge in the world, and she is even said to have written works of her own on subjects like medicine and cosmetics and weights and measures, a scholar queen as much as a warrior queen. She was the first ruler of her Greek dynasty in 300 years to bother to learn the language of the Egyptian people she ruled, and she understood, better than any of her ancestors, that power rested on the loyalty and the imagination of ordinary people, and not only on the men in the palace. She was brave, to the point of recklessness, willing to gamble her life on a single bold stroke, whether folded in a carpet or sailing up a river as a goddess, or hauling her dying lover up a wall with a rope. And her famous charm, the thing the ancient writers struggled to describe, was not, they insist, mere physical beauty, but something rarer and more formidable, intelligence, wit, presence, a voice like music, and a total concentrated attention that made whoever she spoke with feel like the only person in the world. That is not the weapon of an empty-headed temptress. It is the weapon of one of the most capable and compelling human beings of her age. A woman who, denied by her time and her sex the ordinary avenues of power, used every gift she had, mind and charm and courage and wealth and will, to play the highest game there was, against the greatest men in the world, and who very nearly won. She lost, in the end, not because she was weak or foolish, but because she backed the man who lost, and because arrayed against her was Octavian, one of the coldest and cleverest political operators who has ever lived, and because behind Octavian stood the sheer, grinding, inexhaustible power of Rome, which in that age simply ground down everything in its path, every kingdom and every king and every queen. She was the last and the most brilliant of the many rulers who tried to stand against the rising tide of Rome, and like all the others she was swept away, but unlike almost all the others she has never been forgotten, and there is a kind of victory in that too. For 2,000 years now, the woman Octavian tried to erase and to slander has outshone him in the memory of the world. Far more people, tonight, know the name of Cleopatra than know the name of the man who defeated her. And though he founded an empire and she lost a kingdom, it is her name, not his, that has become a byword for glamour and intelligence and doomed romance and the tragic grandeur of a great life brought. Lo, the lighthouse that burned at the mouth of her harbour is long gone, thrown down by earthquakes and swallowed by the sea. The great library is ash and memory. The tomb where she and Antony were laid together is lost, its place unknown, perhaps beneath the waters of the harbour where divers still search for the drowned palaces of her city. Even the exact means of her death is uncertain, and the day of her birth, and the face behind the legend. And yet she remains, more vivid across 2,000 years than almost anyone else of the ancient world. The last pharaoh, the queen who drank a pearl and gambled a kingdom and died a goddess rather than live a captive, still sailing, in the imagination of the world, up a river under purple sails toward whatever waits. Let us stay a little longer in that quiet place at the end, where the great events have all played out and there is nothing left to do but sit with what remains. Because there is something soothing, I think, in looking back across a whole long life once it is finished, and seeing the shape of it entire. The way you might stand on a hill in the evening and look back across a country you have walked through all day, and see the whole road at once, winding away behind you into the blue distance, every hard climb and every easy stretch small and gentle now and far away. From up here, at this distance, the fears and the terrors and the desperate gambles of that life lose their sharp edges and become simply the pattern of a life, the way any life, seen from far enough away, becomes a kind of quiet music. Think of how it began. A small watchful girl in a vast marble palace by the sea, learning her languages, listening at doors, in a family that taught her. Before she was 10, that the people closest to you may be the ones most likely to do you harm, and that a throne is a thing you hold with both hands or lose forever. Think of the city she grew up in, the greatest city in the world, all white stone and long straight streets running down to the double harbour. The great flame of the lighthouse burning all night at the water's edge, the 500,000 scrolls of the library gathered under one roof, the accumulated learning of every people around the sea, and a princess with a hungry mind free to wander in it. Think of the night in the boat, the young woman folded up small in the dark, carried past her enemies at the risk of her life toward a single tired Roman, and the gamble of everything she had, and how that gamble came in and set her, still barely more than a girl, on the throne of the richest land on earth. Think of the barge with its purple sails and silver oars gliding up the river through the sweet perfumed smoke, the goddess come to meet the god, and the golden winter of pleasure that followed, the fishing trips and the pranks and the salted fish on the hook, two of the cleverest people of their age delighting in each other while they still could. And think of the long, slow sunset at the end, the feasting in the shadow of ruin, the ropes let down from the high window, the royal robes and the basket of figs, and the crown set straight one last time by a dying hand. It is a life with the shape of a great story, because it truly had that shape, rise and height and fall, and perhaps that is part of why it has never let the world go. But there is another reason, quieter and deeper, that these ancient lives are worth carrying with us down into sleep, and it is this. Everyone in this story is gone, and has been gone for 2,000 years, and the huge, urgent, world-shaking things they fought and schemed and died for are all, now simply history, the settled and finished past, no longer able to frighten or to hurt anyone. The wars that seemed, to the people living through them, to be the end of the world are chapters in a book. The queen who could not sleep for fear of the chains and the triumph has slept now, undisturbed, for 2,000 years, wherever her lost tomb lies beneath the sea or the sand of her city. And there is, in that, not sadness only, but a strange and genuine comfort. The same comfort you feel looking up at the old patient stars which were shining over that palace by the sea exactly as they shine over you tonight, and which will go on shining long after all our own urgent troubles have become, in their turn, quiet history. The things that keep us awake at night feel, in the dark, enormous and permanent, and they are almost never either. They are passing weather. Even the very greatest of them, the falls of kingdoms, the deaths of queens, become, given enough of the gentle sanding of time, smooth and small and almost peaceful, stories to be told softly in the dark to help a tired person let go of the day. And here is one last small thread to hold as you drift, a thread that runs, unbroken, from that ancient palace all the way to the room where you are lying now. When Julius Caesar wanted to fix the broken drifting calendar of Rome, to make the months line up again with the sun and the seasons, he turned to the star-watching wisdom of Cleopatra's own city, to the astronomers of Alexandria, and it was their learning, the patient measuring of the heavens by scholars in the greatest library on earth, that gave the world the calendar of 365 days with an extra day slipped in every 4th year, the calendar refined only a little since, that still governs your days and your nights, your weekends and your seasons, the date that sat at the top of your screen when you began to listen tonight. Every time you glance at a calendar, some faint forgotten echo of Cleopatra's Alexandria is looking back at you, a quiet gift from her lost city of light, still ordering your days 2,000 years after the lighthouse fell into the sea. So the past is never quite as far away as it seems. It is under our feet, and in our calendars, and in the words we speak, and in the shapes of the stories we tell each other in the dark. History does not really disappear. It only settles, slowly, and becomes the ground beneath us, the deep soft layers on which the present quietly rests. And you are resting now, on all of it, on all those countless finished lives, held up by them, the way the warm dark water of that ancient harbour held up the little boat and the young woman folded inside it, carrying her gently through the night toward whatever came next. There is nothing for you to carry tonight. All of it, the whole long story, the palace and the river and the lighthouse and the queen, is finished and safe and very far away, and asks nothing of you but that you let it drift through your mind like slow water and carry you down with it into sleep. And so we come to the end of the story and to the end of our time together tonight. The last queen of Egypt has taken her rest 2,000 years ago, and the world she knew has become the ground beneath our feet, and there is nothing left now but the quiet, and your own slow breathing, and the small familiar weight of your body sinking a little deeper into the bed. You do not need to remember any of it. Not the names, not the dates, not who was whose brother or which war came before which. If you have followed the sound of my voice down into the edges of sleep and lost the thread of the story somewhere along the way, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do, and you can let the whole of it go now, the palace and the river and the lighthouse and the crown. Let it all drift away downstream like a boat carried off on the dark water, growing smaller and smaller until it is gone. Are you still awake? If you are, there is no need to do anything at all. There is another long, quiet story waiting for you on the screen if you would like one, ready to carry you the rest of the way whenever you are ready for it. And if you have enjoyed this, and only if you truly have, you might, in the morning, when there is no hurry, tap the like button or subscribe, so that other people lying awake in the dark, in other cities, in other time zones, can find their way to a calm place at the end of their own long days. And if you feel like it, you could leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, because I love to read them in the quiet, and it helps someone else, somewhere, feel a little less alone in the middle of the night. But all of that can wait for the morning. The morning will take care of itself. For now, there is nothing left for you to do, and nowhere you need to be, and no one who needs anything from you at all. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your hands lie open and still. Let the last of the day's small worries loosen their grip, one quiet finger at a time, and slip away into the dark, where they can do you no harm. You are safe, and you are warm, and you have done enough today, more than enough, and now it is time simply to rest. Let your breathing slow. Let it grow soft and even and deep. And let the great flame of the old lighthouse burn low and lower out at the edge of the dark water until it is only a single point of gold, and then not even that. Close your eyes, let everything be still. Good night, and sleep well, and sweet dreams.